I had been restless for weeks, sitting in my apartment with the same routine every day, so I decided I needed to clear my head. The city felt heavy and loud, and I thought maybe a night in the park would help me reset. There was a large state park about 2 hours away from me, filled with miles of trails, wooded areas, and a few small lakes tucked between the hills. People camped there all the time, but I knew if I went far enough off the main road I could find a spot that felt more private. I wanted space, quiet, and the kind of stillness you don't get surrounded by concrete walls and traffic noise. I packed light but enough to stay overnight. A tent, sleeping bag, small propane stove, a knife, a headlamp, a water filter, and some food. I threw everything into my pack early in the afternoon and drove to the park. The sky was clear, the sun warm but not too harsh, and the kind of breeze that felt good when it moved through the trees. I checked in at the main gate, got my day pass, and then parked my car near one of the trailheads. From there, I hiked in. The trails weren't crowded that day. I passed only a couple of families heading back toward the lot, their kids running ahead of them with sticks. Once I walked deeper into the trees, the voices faded, and the sound of the wind moving through the branches replaced them. I walked for an hour, then another, putting distance between myself and the areas where most people camped. The park had established campgrounds with fire pits and restrooms, but I wasn't looking for that. I wanted the quiet. I cut off the main trail and followed a narrower side path that looked less traveled, just a faint line in the leaves. The deeper I went, the more I felt like I was finally where I wanted to be. I found a flat clearing not far from a small creek. The creek would give me water if I needed it, and the sound of it running over the rocks was calming. The trees around me were tall and spaced enough that I could see a decent distance in all directions, but still felt sheltered. It was early evening by then, so I set up camp right away. I pitched the tent, rolled out the sleeping bag, and gathered some dry wood in case I wanted a fire later. I cooked some food on the small stove and ate while sitting on a fallen log. Everything felt normal. Peaceful even. The sun dropped lower and the woods grew darker, taking on that quiet, heavy feeling they get at dusk. I lit a small fire, not too big, just enough for light and warmth. The sounds of birds faded, replaced by the chirping of insects. I leaned back, staring at the sky through the break in the trees. It was exactly what I'd hoped for. Silence, fresh air, no one around. After a while, I put out the fire and crawled into the tent. The ground was firm beneath my sleeping bag, but I was tired enough to not care. I lay there with my headlamp turned off, listening to the creek and the insects outside. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up. It was still dark, but the air felt colder. My body tensed the way it does when something wakes you, but you don't know what it was. At first I thought maybe it was just a dream that startled me awake. Then I heard it. A sound that didn't belong to the normal night noises. It was faint, maybe 50 feet away, the sound of movement through dry leaves. Slow, deliberate, one step at a time. I froze, my ears straining. The woods are always alive with small animals, raccoons, squirrels, deer. But this didn't sound like them. It was too heavy, too steady. I told myself it was probably a deer, but the way it stopped and started didn't fit. It wasn't the careless movement of an animal wandering. It sounded like someone trying to move quietly. I lay there, barely breathing, waiting. The steps paused for long stretches, then started again. Closer. Always closer. My heart pounded so hard I could feel it in my throat. I reached for the knife I had left inside the tent with me and held it in my hand. I considered turning on my headlamp, but I was afraid the sudden light would show whoever, or whatever it was, exactly where I was. The sound circled slowly, moving from one side of my camp to the other. I could hear sticks snap softly, then silence, then another step. It went on like that for what felt like forever, and then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound at all. Just the creek and the insects again. I lay there for the rest of the night, barely sleeping, my grip tight on the knife. Every little rustle outside made me flinch. When the first light broke through the trees, I finally let out the breath I'd been holding. The woods looked the same as they had the evening before. Normal. Calm. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, scanning the clearing. At first I didn't see anything unusual. Then I noticed the ground near the edge of the clearing. The leaves were disturbed, pressed down in long, uneven patches like someone had stood there. Not animal tracks. Shoe prints. That sight made my stomach turn. I hadn't imagined it. Someone really had been out there circling my camp in the dark. I packed up quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed the sleeping bag into my pack and took down the tent. I wanted to be gone, but as I strapped my gear on, I stopped and thought about it. The park was big. Maybe it had been another camper wandering. Maybe they hadn't meant harm. But the way they had moved, slow, deliberate, careful, that wasn't someone just stumbling through the woods at night. I debated leaving right then, hiking out and driving home, but I had come out here to get away, and a part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe if I moved to a different spot, farther off the trail, I'd feel better. I convinced myself it was a one-time thing, and I stayed. I hiked for hours deeper into the woods, keeping my eyes sharp for signs of anyone else. I didn't see a soul. By the time the sun started to lower again, I found another clearing near a thicker patch of trees. This spot felt more hidden, and I tried to reassure myself with that. I set up camp again, though this time I didn't bother with a fire. I wanted to stay unnoticed. As night fell, I cooked quickly on the stove, ate, and cleaned up everything, making sure I left no food out. I got into the tent before it was even fully dark, the knife again beside me. I lay there listening to every sound, trying to pick out what was normal and what wasn't. The hours dragged, and then, sometime after midnight, it started again. The faint crunch of leaves, slow and careful. My chest tightened instantly. I held my breath and listened. The steps were closer this time. They stopped and started like before, circling. I could hear the faint sound of breathing outside the tent. Not an animal, not even a question now. Someone was standing just feet away from me in the dark. I stayed frozen, gripping the knife so hard my hand hurt. The steps moved again, dragging slowly around the clearing, then stopping. Long silence, then a faint scrape against a tree like a hand brushing bark. My skin crawled. Whoever it was, they were trying to unnerve me. This time it went on longer. Hours, maybe. Every time I thought they were gone, I'd hear it again. At one point, I thought I saw the faintest shadow move across the thin tent wall, like someone passing in front of it. I didn't move, didn't breathe, my entire body stiff with fear. Finally, just before dawn, the noises stopped. The silence that followed was worse in some ways. I didn't know if they had left or if they were just standing somewhere in the trees waiting. When the sun finally rose, I unzipped the tent slowly, my knife still in hand. The clearing looked empty, but then I saw it. Hanging from a low branch just a few feet from the tent was a strip of cloth. Torn, dirty, tied into a knot. It hadn't been there the night before. I stared at it, my stomach dropping. It was proof, undeniable proof. Someone had been there. Close enough to touch the trees around my camp, close enough to leave a sign. I tore down my camp in minutes, barely caring how I packed. My only thought was to get out. I followed the creek at first, then cut back toward where I thought the main trail would be. I walked fast, almost running at times, my eyes darting constantly into the woods. Every snapped twig made me spin around. I kept expecting to see someone following me, but the trees were always empty. It took hours, but I finally saw the wide dirt trail and felt the first wave of relief. I wasn't safe yet, but I was closer. I followed it, my legs aching until I reached the parking lot. My car was there exactly as I had left it. But when I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside, I froze again. On the hood of the car, tucked under the windshield wiper, was another piece of cloth. Same kind, same dirty strip tied in a knot. My hands shook as I pulled it free and dropped it on the ground. My mind raced. That meant whoever had been out there had followed me all the way back. They had been in the lot. They had seen my car. I didn't wait. I got inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The entire drive out of the park, I kept checking the mirror, convinced I would see a car behind me, but the road stayed empty. When I finally hit the main highway, I still didn't feel safe. I knew now that it wasn't just chance, wasn't just another camper wandering too close. Someone had followed me, watched me, toyed with me. They knew I was alone, and they had come right up to where I slept twice. They wanted me to know they had been there. And the strip of cloth on my car told me they wanted me to know it wasn't over. I have. I had been camping before, but never inside a public park. Most of the time I stuck to national forests or quiet areas deep in the mountains. But this time I decided to keep things simple. The park was only a few hours away, large enough that you could find trails where you didn't run into people for hours, but close enough that I could pack light and not stress about running out of supplies. The place was known for having long stretches of wooded areas with little lakes scattered in between. And since I had a couple of days off work, I thought it would be the perfect chance to get out of town and clear my head. The idea of sleeping out in the park didn't bother me at all. I thought it would be less intense than the deeper wilderness trips I had been on. Parks had rangers, patrols, and regular visitors. It felt safe enough, and I honestly looked forward to the easy escape. I packed my small tent, sleeping bag, a small cooler, flashlight, knife, extra batteries, some food, and water. I also threw in a notebook and pen because I liked to write down thoughts when I was out alone. By the time I got there, the parking lot was almost empty. It was early afternoon, the kind of late summer day where the sun still had heat but the air was cooler when you stepped under trees. The paths stretched out in different directions with signs pointing toward the lakes, the camp zones, and some longer trails. I decided to pick one of the less crowded camping spots, somewhere near the lake but far enough down the trail that most casual visitors wouldn't wander by. Walking deeper into the park, I started to notice how quickly the sounds of the road faded. First you only hear a few cars, then it's nothing but birds and the rustle of leaves. The trail was covered in fallen leaves and broken twigs, soft under my boots. Every so often I would see a squirrel darting off or hear branches creak above me. When I finally found the spot I wanted, it was a clearing not too far from the lake. You could still see the water through a thin line of trees. The ground was flat, enough space for my tent, and it looked like people had camped there before. There were some rocks stacked in a circle, the kind of makeshift fire ring campers build. I liked that it looked lived in but not crowded. Setting up didn't take long. I staked down the tent, spread my sleeping bag inside, and left my bag leaned up against the side. I didn't plan on building a big fire, just enough to cook later. For now, I wanted to walk around and see the place before it got dark. The lake was calm, almost too calm, the surface smooth like glass. Tall grass lined parts of the edge and dragonflies darted across the surface. There were footprints in the mud near the water. Not fresh, but not too old either. Could have been fishermen. Maybe someone just walking along the bank. I crouched down and saw where something had pressed deeper into the mud like a heel. It wasn't strange on its own, but it made me notice that the prints trailed off toward the trees instead of looping back to the water. I figured maybe someone had been exploring and walked off. I stayed near the lake until the sun started dipping lower. The shadows stretched longer, the air cooler. Back at camp, I lit a small fire, enough to warm some food and keep the bugs away. The sound of the crackling wood was relaxing, and for a while, I just sat on a rock and listened to the sounds around me. Crickets were starting up, frogs calling from somewhere closer to the lake. It was when the sky turned dark blue and the trees started blending into a black wall that I noticed how alone it felt. I thought I'd hear distant voices or laughter from other campers, but there was nothing. Just the fire, the bugs, and the faint lapping of water. I told myself it was peaceful, exactly what I had wanted. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left the fire smoldering low. Inside, I stretched out in my bag, flipped my flashlight on, and jotted a few notes in my notebook. My handwriting looked uneven in the beam of light, and the pages cast shadows against the thin walls of the tent. Eventually, I clicked off the light and closed my eyes. It must have been sometime in the middle of the night when I woke up. No sound had woken me, not exactly. It was more like a feeling that pulled me out of sleep, the kind where your body knows something is different. I lay still, listening. At first, there was nothing unusual. The same crickets, the faint stir of branches, the distant frog calls. But then I caught something else. A snap of a twig, not far, maybe just outside the ring of trees near my camp. It wasn't a squirrel, not at this hour. The weight of it sounded heavier, deliberate. I held my breath and listened harder. Another crunch, closer this time. It wasn't rushed, more like slow steps. My tent suddenly felt paper thin. I wished I had zipped it tighter. Wished I hadn't left the fire out. I debated shining my flashlight, but I knew the beam would show where I was even clearer. Instead, I just stayed still, The steps circled, or at least it sounded like they were. One moment off to the left, then behind me. Leaves brushing, the faint thud of weight on soil. Minutes passed, maybe more. My heart thumped so loud I swore it would give me away. Then silence again. No more steps. Nothing but the usual night sounds. I waited, straining my ears, but there was nothing. Slowly I told myself it was probably a deer. Maybe even another camper wandering back to their spot. That thought was the only thing that let me drift back into a light, broken sleep. In the morning, I stepped outside to check. The ground was damp, and sure enough, there were prints in the dirt near the tent. Not animal prints, shoes, the tread of a boot pressed clearly into the soil. They circled close, stopping just a few feet from where I had been lying inside. A chill ran down my arms as I studied them. Whoever it was hadn't come up and said anything. They hadn't called out or passed through. They had just walked around my camp in the dark and left. I told myself it could have been some random hiker. Maybe they didn't see my tent until the last second. Maybe they got curious. But the prints looked like they had paused, like someone had stood there for longer than a passing step. I tried to shake it off, but it stayed with me the whole day. I hiked further down the trail, trying to enjoy the woods, but every broken branch behind me made me turn. Every empty stretch of trail made me wonder if someone was just out of sight. By the time I came back to camp, I had made up my mind that I would only stay one more night. I cooked, ate quickly, and cleaned up. I didn't want anything to leave a smell or draw attention. When the sun started sinking again, I built a small fire but kept it low, more for comfort than anything. That night was worse. I went into the tent earlier, zipped it tight, and kept my flashlight in one hand. For a long time, nothing happened. I drifted in and out of shallow sleep, my nerves too wound up. Then I heard it again. The steps. Slow, careful circling. This time I forced myself to look through a gap in the tent flap. The fire outside was almost gone, just glowing embers, but in the faint light, I thought I saw a shape move. Tall human standing just beyond the trees. I froze, hardly breathing. The figure stayed there, not moving closer, not backing away, just standing, watching. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, my muscles locked, my throat dry. At some point I must have dozed because the next time I opened my eyes, the sky outside was already lighter. When I crawled out, there were fresh footprints again, deeper this time, leading back toward the trees. That was it. I packed up fast, hardly bothering to fold my tent properly. My hands shook as I stuffed everything into my bag. I didn't look back at the lake, didn't linger at the fire pit. I just shouldered my gear and walked as quickly as I could back toward the main trail. Every sound behind me made me stiffen. I imagined the same boots following, the same slow steps. By the time I reached the parking lot, my shirt clung to me with sweat. The sight of my car sitting there in the morning light was the only relief I felt. I threw everything in the back and got in. When I turned the key, the sound of the engine almost drowned out the racing in my chest. I drove out without looking in the rearview mirror, not wanting to see if anyone was standing at the tree line. Later, when I was back in my apartment, the silence of the park still pressed in my ears. I kept thinking about the prints, the slow circling, the figure in the trees. Whoever it was hadn't tried to talk, hadn't asked for help, hadn't made themselves known. They had just watched. And I realized then what unsettled me most. If I hadn't woken up, if I hadn't opened my eyes at the right time, I might never have known they were there at all. That was the last time I ever camped in a park. I had decided to spend the weekend camping in a large public park not far from the edge of the city. It wasn't deep wilderness, not the kind of place where you'd expect to see bears or mountain lions, but it was still big enough that if you walked far enough from the main road, you could almost forget you were anywhere near houses or traffic. The park had woods, fields, small lakes, and walking trails that wound in all directions. People usually came here during the day for jogging, walking dogs, or family picnics, but at night it changed completely. The wide open fields became dark shadows. The trails felt longer than they should, and the woods swallowed the light as soon as the sun dipped. I wanted that feeling, that silence where you only hear your own footsteps and the rustle of leaves. I had been camping many times before, but this was the first time I chose this park. It was legal to camp in some parts if you had a permit, and I did. I packed light, carrying only my tent, a small sleeping bag, a flashlight, food, water, and a pocket knife. I figured I didn't need much else since it was only one night and civilization wasn't far. That thought comforted me during the day as I picked my spot. I walked away from the main path through a clearing that led to a smaller trail marked with an old wooden sign, faded and leaning sideways. The ground was covered in dry leaves and the air smelled faintly of damp dirt. I found a small patch of flat ground between tall trees where the grass was short and the ground was firm. I set my tent up there. It wasn't far from a small lake I had noticed on the map, though I couldn't see it directly from my camp. By the time the tent was up and I'd gathered some sticks to make a small fire, the sun had already started to lower. The park looked softer then, shadows stretching across the ground and the tops of the trees glowing orange. The last joggers passed by in the distance, faint figures between the trees. Soon after that, the silence took over. I lit a small fire in a safe spot surrounded by stones, cooked a simple meal, and sat on the ground listening. The park at night wasn't silent like I expected. It was alive in a different way. The wind pressed through the trees in long sighs. Small animals scurried in the undergrowth. Birds made occasional sharp calls before going quiet again. From time to time I thought I heard footsteps, but when I focused it was just branches shifting or something, dropping from a tree. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was nearby. It was faint, just a pressure in the air. The same way you sense when someone is standing behind you even before you turn around. I reminded myself this was a park, not a deep forest, and anyone could be walking a trail at night. Maybe another camper, maybe someone fishing by the lake. I forced myself to relax, to sit back against a tree and stare into the fire. Hours slipped by and the woods grew darker. The stars came out above the treetops and the cool air made me pull my jacket tighter. Around midnight, I put out the fire carefully with water I had carried and dirt I pushed over the coals until no smoke rose. The darkness that followed was heavy. My flashlight lit only a narrow circle of pale ground and trees, and outside of it was just black. Inside the tent, I zipped the flap closed, lay down and tried to sleep. But I couldn't. The noises outside seemed sharper now. I heard something moving through leaves at different times, not in a steady rhythm like an animal. It would crunch closer, then stop. Then later, more crunching, slow, deliberate, like careful steps. I held my breath, listening, my whole body tense. I told myself it was raccoons or deer, but deep down I didn't believe it. I shifted in the sleeping bag, every sound magnified in the thin fabric walls of the tent. Then I heard it, a faint metallic sound, almost like something brushing against metal. It was far, but not far enough. I reached quietly for the pocket knife near my bag. The small weight in my hand gave me only a little comfort. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, half asleep, half awake, until I must have drifted off. When I opened my eyes again, the tent was gray with morning light. I felt relief instantly. Outside, the woods were still but less threatening. I unzipped the flap and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place. The ground was undisturbed, my camp was as I left it. I made a small breakfast, packed my things, and walked down toward the lake before heading out. The trail to the lake was narrow, lined with tall weeds and low branches. The air was cool and damp and the ground soft. I followed it until I saw the water glinting through the trees. The surface was calm, smooth like glass, and the shore was muddy near the edge. I froze when I saw footprints there. Not animal prints, but human. Bare feet, pressed deep into the mud, heading away from the water and into the trees. The size looked like an adult's, long, narrow, and sharp at the toes. I crouched and touched one. It was fresh. The edges were clean, not softened by wind or time. A chill ran through me. Someone had been walking barefoot in the park near where I camped at night. I stood there, scanning the tree line, my heart pounding. The footprints disappeared into the grass and underbrush. I couldn't see where they went. I felt exposed, standing out in the open, so I backed away and returned to the main trail quickly. My legs moved fast, almost running, until I reached the wider paths closer to the parking area. I didn't look back. By the time I reached my car, the lot was empty except for one old pickup parked crookedly near the far edge. The windows were fogged and I couldn't see inside. I didn't want to. I loaded my gear into the trunk, started the engine, and drove out without hesitation. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the thought of those footprints. Who walked barefoot through the park in the middle of the night? Why did I hear slow, careful steps outside my tent? The park wasn't wilderness. It was surrounded by neighborhoods and roads. Whoever it was, they chose to be out there at night, moving silently among the trees close enough for me to hear. I realized then how thin the fabric of the tent had been, how exposed I really was. One zip, one pull, and someone could have been inside. I had nothing but a small knife, no barrier, no warning. The thought stayed with me, clear as the footprints pressed into the mud. That was the last time I camped in that park. I've camped in other places since then, deeper in the woods, far from roads and people. But never again there. The memory of lying awake in that thin tent while someone moved through the darkness nearby will never leave me. I had been meaning to get away for a while, and when the weekend lined up with a stretch of good weather, I decided to pack my gear and spend 2 nights camping at a state park a few hours from home. It wasn't a huge park, but it was known for its big lake, thick woods, and several trails that wrapped around the shoreline. I figured it would be the perfect spot to clear my head. I wanted something simple. Away from people, away from noise, just me, my tent, and the quiet sounds of the woods. I drove in late that afternoon, checked in at the ranger station, and followed the long paved road deeper into the park. The campground wasn't full. Maybe a quarter of the sites were taken, mostly families with RVs and groups cooking on grills. I didn't want to be around any of that. I wanted to be somewhere with less activity, so I chose a tent site further from the main loop, one that backed right up to a thin line of trees and opened out toward the lake. I parked, hauled my gear out of the trunk, and walked it down the little dirt pad. The site was simple, just a flat patch for a tent, a fire ring, and a wooden picnic table. I pitched my tent first, tightening the lines until the nylon was stretched clean, then laid out my sleeping bag inside and set the cooler under the table. The lake was a short walk down a slope. From my spot, I could see the water through the trees, shining a dull orange under the sinking sun. The first evening was calm. I made a small fire, cooked a couple hot dogs, and sat back while the woods dimmed around me. The families further down the loop were still laughing and moving about, but their voices were distant enough that I mostly heard the sounds of the woods, the chirp of crickets, the buzz of insects, the faint lapping of water against the shore. I felt relaxed, like I had finally unplugged from everything that usually pressed on me during the week. When it got dark, I killed the fire and crawled into the tent. The ground was a little uneven, but I settled into the bag and stared at the nylon ceiling until sleep came. At some point in the night, I woke to a sound outside. At first, it was just the snapping of a branch. My mind immediately went to deer. This area had plenty of them, and they moved through campsites without care. I lay still, listening, the nylon wall between me and whatever was outside. The sound came again, closer this time. Something heavy pressed into the leaves, not a squirrel or raccoon, something with weight. My chest tightened as I waited, barely breathing, my hand gripping the flashlight I kept beside the bag. I thought about switching it on, but I didn't. I figured it was best to stay quiet and let it pass. The footsteps moved slow, then stopped just outside the tent wall. I could hear the leaves shifting under its weight, and then silence. My ears strained. My heartbeat felt so loud it drowned out the insects. After a long moment, the steps moved again, fading into the distance until all I heard was the steady chorus of crickets. I didn't sleep well after that. My mind spun with every possible explanation, from a curious animal to another camper walking too close. But the way the steps had paused right outside the tent, it didn't feel random. Morning brought relief. The sunlight pushed through the nylon, and when I finally stepped out, the campsite looked exactly as I had left it. The fire pit was cold, the cooler was untouched, and the ground showed no clear tracks. I told myself it was a deer or maybe even the wind pushing branches down. I cooked some eggs on my little stove, ate, and decided to hike a trail that wrapped around the far side of the lake. The trail was quiet, shaded by tall oaks and maples. I passed a few hikers near the beginning, but after half an hour I was alone. The stillness was heavy, broken only by the occasional call of a bird. I walked slow, taking in the calm water through gaps in the trees. At one point, I stopped to drink from my bottle and noticed something odd across the lake. On the opposite shore, maybe 200 yards away, a figure stood near the water. It looked like a man, but he wasn't fishing, swimming, or doing anything I could make sense of. He just stood still, facing the water, unmoving. I watched for a while, expecting him to shift or walk away, but he didn't. Even at that distance, it felt strange, like he knew I was watching. I shook it off, reminded myself that people did weird things all the time in parks, and kept walking. Still, the image stuck in my head. A lone figure standing motionless at the water's edge. By the time I circled back, the sun was sliding lower. I returned to camp, tired but uneasy. I built a fire, cooked dinner, and tried to relax. The families nearby were louder that night, and their noise actually comforted me. But when it got late and I put out the fire, the woods swallowed everything again. Lying in the tent, I tried to focus on the rustle of leaves, the chirping of night insects. Sleep came in short bursts. Sometime after midnight, I woke again. At first, I thought it was silence that woke me. The crickets had stopped. Then I heard it. A slow crunch of footsteps, steady and deliberate. They came from the slope near the lake, moving toward my sight. My stomach dropped. The steps stopped at the edge of the campsite. I could hear breathing now, faint but steady, like someone trying to stay quiet. My hand clutched the flashlight. I lay frozen, every muscle tense. The person, or whatever it was, stood there for what felt like forever. Then the sound of movement again. Slow steps circling the tent. Leaves shifted, twigs snapped. My throat went dry. Whoever it was, they weren't walking past. They were moving around me, close, studying. I forced myself not to move. My mind raced through what I had in reach. The flashlight, a pocket knife in my backpack, the metal tent stakes. My heart hammered so hard it made my vision blur in the darkness. After another eternity, the steps drifted back toward the slope, fading until the woods returned to their usual chorus. I didn't sleep at all after that. I lay awake, staring into the dark, waiting for another sound. My body ached with tension, but I didn't dare unzip the tent. The thought of seeing someone standing there was worse than not knowing. When dawn broke, I crawled out and scanned the ground. The leaves and dirt around the tent were disturbed in ways I couldn't explain away as animals. The imprints weren't clear footprints, but they were spaced like steps circling. My stomach twisted. I told myself I should pack up and leave, but pride and stubbornness kept me. I had planned 2 nights, and I wasn't going to be scared off by some stranger or trick of my imagination. I tried to act normal. Cooking breakfast, walking to the lake, even reading a book at the picnic table. But my nerves were shredded. Every sound in the woods put me on edge. That afternoon, I decided to take the car into town for a while just to get out. I drove aimlessly, grabbed a meal, and sat in the diner longer than I needed to. I didn't want to go back, but eventually I did. When I pulled into the site, everything looked untouched. I rebuilt the fire, cooked dinner, and told myself I'd be fine. But as darkness came, the fear returned heavier than before. I sat by the fire longer than usual, letting the flames die slow, stretching out the moment before I had to crawl into the tent. When I finally did, my chest was tight with dread. It wasn't long before I heard it again, slow, steady steps approaching through the leaves. My skin crawled. The steps came closer, closer, then stopped at the edge of the tent. Silence pressed down. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and shallow. Then a new sound, the faint scrape of something dragging across the nylon wall. Not an animal. A hand, I snapped. I grabbed the flashlight and flicked it on, the beam slicing through the tent. I yelled out, hoping to scare whoever it was, though my voice cracked with panic. The scraping stopped. Heavy steps retreated fast into the woods, crunching leaves and snapping branches. My hand shook so hard I could barely hold the light. I stayed up the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, heart racing. At first light, I packed everything into the car without even eating. My hands moved frantic, tossing gear into the trunk, eyes scanning the tree line every few seconds. When I slammed the last door shut, I looked back once at the empty site, the silent woods, and then I drove. I didn't stop until I was out of the park, back on the highway, the trees shrinking in the mirror. My chest stayed tight the whole way home, and even when I pulled into my driveway hours later, the relief didn't come. I kept thinking of the sound of those steps circling the tent, the scrape on the nylon, the way someone had been right there inches from me, waiting in the dark. I never went back to that park again. Even now, whenever I hear a twig snap at night, it takes me right back to that tent lying still, while someone walked slow circles around me. I decided to camp at the state park on a late summer weekend when the weather was dry and warm but not too hot. The park was big, with trails winding through woods and some open grassy areas where people set up tents. I picked a spot away from the main campground because I wanted quiet. I had been stressed with work and wanted time to breathe without cars, phones, or the noise of people. The area I chose was near a line of trees with the trail running down into thicker woods. There weren't many people around this side of the park. I saw a few hikers earlier in the day, but as the sun dropped, it felt like I had the place to myself. I set up my tent near a tree that gave me shade and laid out my sleeping bag. I built a small fire in the designated fire ring, cooked a simple meal, and sat back while the woods darkened. The air smelled like pine and dry grass. Crickets started their steady sound, and I could hear something moving now and then deeper in the brush, probably a rabbit or raccoon. As it got darker, I noticed how different the park felt. In the day it had seemed friendly, like any public space with trails and signs, but at night the shadows made everything unfamiliar. The trees looked taller, the trail seemed to vanish quicker, and every sound carried farther. I told myself it was normal and tried to relax by the fire. When I finally lay down inside my tent, I felt exposed. The thin fabric separated me from everything outside. I could hear the smallest noises, twigs snapping, leaves shifting, the scurry of something across the dirt. I tried to ignore it, but then I heard something heavier. It wasn't the random steps of a deer or the fast movement of a small animal. It was slow, like careful footsteps. I froze in my sleeping bag and held my breath, waiting. The steps stopped. Then I thought maybe I imagined it. After some minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing and closed my eyes. Sometime later, I woke again. It was still dark, but colder. My fire had burned down, leaving only faint glowing coals. What woke me wasn't sound this time, but a feeling like someone was close. I listened hard and then heard it, breathing, not mine. It was faint but steady, just outside the thin wall of my tent. My chest tightened. I didn't move at first. I tried to convince myself it could be an animal sniffing around, but it sounded too steady, too human. I finally sat up slowly and reached for the flashlight I kept by my head. My hand shook as I clicked it on. The beam cut across the thin tent fabric, showing shapes of the trees outside. I couldn't see anyone. I unzipped the flap just enough to point the light out. The beam swept across the trees and ground. Nothing. No person, no animal. Just stillness. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stayed awake for hours, flashlight in hand, turning it on and off, sweeping the area outside my tent each time. The woods looked empty. Finally, exhaustion made me drift off again. The next morning, everything looked normal. Bright sun, quiet woods, the trail stretching out the way it had yesterday. I almost laughed at myself for being so tense the night before. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I walked around my campsite to check. The ground was dry dirt and pine needles. Near the edge of my tent, I saw marks that didn't look like animal tracks. They looked like shoe prints, faint but clear enough in the morning light. They circled my tent, close, as if someone had walked slowly around it. My stomach tightened again. I tried to reason it out. Maybe another camper wandered by in the night. But there was no reason for someone to walk directly up to my tent and stand there. The prints weren't fresh enough to know exactly when they were made, but they hadn't been there when I set up camp. The thought of leaving crossed my mind, but I didn't want to overreact. It was a public park after all. People walked around. Maybe someone was curious. I forced myself to stay calm. I spent the day hiking the trail deeper into the park. I carried only a day pack and left my main gear at camp. The farther I walked, the more empty the park felt. Hours passed without seeing a single person. When I finally turned back, I felt a small relief seeing my tent still standing in the clearing. But when I got closer, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. My tent zipper was open halfway. I knew I had zipped it shut before leaving. I stepped inside, heart pounding, and saw my sleeping bag unrolled but shifted like someone had been inside. My backpack was unzipped. Nothing seemed to be missing, but everything had been disturbed. Someone had been in my tent. I stood there in silence, trying to think. Leaving now made the most sense. But part of me hesitated because it was still daytime. If I packed and left, maybe I'd be fine. Another part of me thought about how far the parking lot was, at least an hour's walk. Maybe more. If whoever had been here was still around, would they follow? I built up the fire again to make myself feel safer. The sun sank lower. The shadows stretched long, and I couldn't stop glancing at the tree line. Every time a branch moved or a bird startled, I flinched. I ate a cold meal and sat close to the fire, waiting for night. As darkness settled again, the sounds returned. Small movements at first, then silence, then faint cracks like something stepping carefully. My eyes kept scanning the trees. I held my flashlight in one hand and a camping knife in the other. Hours passed with me sitting stiff by the fire, barely moving. Sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Breathing. Slow, steady, close. This time it came from the far side of the fire. I swung the flashlight in that direction. For a second, I caught sight of something, a figure standing between the trees. It was tall, unmoving, just outside the edge of the light. My hand shook so badly the beam wavered, and when it steadied, the figure was gone. My chest was tight, every muscle tense. I didn't know if I had really seen someone or if the shadows had played a trick. I didn't sleep at all that night. By dawn, I had already packed my gear in a rush. My hands shook as I tore down the tent. I didn't care about folding things neatly. I stuffed everything in my pack and started down the trail toward the parking lot. My eyes kept darting behind me, scanning the trees, half expecting to see someone following. The trail felt longer than before. My legs were heavy and every sound made me turn my head. At one point, I heard something behind me, quick footsteps, but when I spun around, the trail was empty. The woods were still. I forced myself to keep moving. When I finally saw the edge of the lot, I almost ran. My car was the only one parked there. Relief washed over me as I unlocked the door and threw my pack inside. My hands were trembling too hard to put the key in at first. When the engine finally started, I pulled out fast and didn't look back. The drive home felt unreal, like I had stepped out of something I shouldn't have been part of. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half convinced I'd see someone there. When I finally reached my apartment and locked the door behind me, only then did I start to feel safe. But the thing that sticks with me most wasn't the footsteps, or even the figure I think I saw. It was the zipper. Someone had been inside my tent, going through my things, maybe lying in my sleeping bag while I was away. That meant they knew exactly where I was sleeping that night. They knew how helpless I was, zipped up in a thin nylon shell thinking I was alone. I decided to spend the weekend camping at a large state park that I had never been to before. I had read about it online and it seemed like a good place to get away from everything for a couple of days. The park stretched for miles with thick woods, trails, lakes, and open fields. It wasn't too far from the city, but it was big enough that once you got deep inside, you felt cut off from everything. I packed a small tent, food, water, and the usual camping gear. I wanted peace, quiet, and a bit of time alone. When I got there, I parked in the designated lot, filled out the camping permit slip, and hiked about 2 miles into the woods. The air smelled clean, a mix of pine and damp soil. The deeper I went, the less I heard of traffic and the more I noticed the constant hum of insects, the rustle of leaves, and the occasional woodpecker hammering at a tree. It felt calm, and for the first few hours I thought it was exactly what I needed. I set up my tent in a small clearing near a thin path that didn't look like it was used much anymore. The grass around it was a little higher than the main trails, and I saw no boot prints, no tire marks from bikes. That actually made me happy because it meant fewer people walking by. I wanted the feeling of being far away. I put my backpack down, unrolled my sleeping bag, set up a small fire pit with some dry branches I had gathered, and got everything ready before dark. The evening came fast. The shadows stretched across the clearing and the birds quieted down. The park grew still, the kind of silence that feels heavy. where you almost notice the absence of sound more than sound itself. I ate a quick meal from a tin can, washed it down with water, and sat near the fire I had built. The flames flickered against the trees and made the branches look like they were moving, like figures swaying in the dark. I told myself not to think like that. I stayed awake longer than I meant to, just listening. I could hear small things, a twig snapping, a leaf rustling, but I assumed it was animals. Probably raccoons or squirrels moving around at night. I wasn't worried. It must have been around midnight when I finally crawled into my tent and zipped the flap shut. I laid down inside my sleeping bag and shut my eyes, but I didn't sleep right away. I could still hear things. The sounds weren't constant. They came in bursts, like something moving, then stopping. A shuffle, then silence. A crunch of leaves, then nothing. I told myself it was deer. Parks like this had plenty of deer, and deer are noisy when they walk through dry leaves. But it wasn't steady. It wasn't like an animal moving through. It was like something was pacing, stopping, waiting. I kept holding my breath, trying to listen closer. Each time when I thought it was gone, it started again, closer to my tent, then farther away. I gripped the little camping knife I always kept near my bag. It was stupid. I knew it was probably nothing. Still, holding it made me feel a bit more secure. After maybe an hour, the sounds faded, and eventually I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up in the morning, I stepped outside the tent, stretching. The fire had burned out during the night, leaving only a pile of gray ash. I went to gather some wood, and that's when I noticed it. Footprints, not boot prints like hikers, not paw prints like animals. They were bare feet. Human. They were faint but clear enough in the soft dirt near my tent. The prints circled around my campsite, going close to my tent and then looping back. My stomach sank. I stood there staring for a long time. Someone had been out there barefoot, walking around my tent in the middle of the night. They didn't leave anything behind. No trash, no sign they had sat down. Just those faint footprints. I thought about packing up and leaving right then. But I had just gotten here and I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe some weird hiker. Maybe a local who wandered off a trail. I forced myself to push it away, though deep down I knew it wasn't right. The day was fine. I hiked a trail that looped around the lake, saw a few people fishing, and nodded at a couple of other hikers. Being around other people calmed me a little. It reminded me that I wasn't completely alone out there. By the time I returned to my camp, the sun was setting again and I was tired from the long walk. I rebuilt my fire, cooked another meal, and tried to enjoy the evening. But when night came, I felt uneasy. I couldn't stop thinking about those prints. That night, the sound started again. At first, it was far off, a shuffle through the leaves, a snap of a branch. I told myself not to move, not to make a sound. I laid flat in my sleeping bag, eyes wide open in the dark. Then it came closer. I heard the steps outside my tent. Slow, careful, not rushing. Whoever it was, they were taking their time. I could hear breathing now. Not loud, but enough that I knew it was human. I held the knife in my hand, my grip so tight that my fingers hurt. The steps circled the tent again. I didn't move. My chest ached from holding my breath. Then I saw the shadow. The thin nylon of my tent glowed faintly from the moonlight, and against it I could see the shape of someone crouching, perfectly still, right outside. They didn't move for what felt like forever. I thought my heart would burst out of my chest. I couldn't take it. I snapped up, unzipped the tent, and shoved my head out with the knife in my hand. There was nothing. No one was there. Just trees and darkness. My hands were shaking, and I thought maybe I had imagined it. I forced myself to sit by the fire, tossing on more wood, and kept it burning the rest of the night. I didn't go back into the tent until the sun came up. When daylight came, I checked again. And there they were. More footprints, fresh. Bare feet circling again, but this time they stopped at the back of my tent. Whoever it was had crouched there, watching, maybe for hours. I packed up right away. I didn't care that I had planned to stay longer. I shoved everything into my backpack, kicked dirt over the fire, and started down the path back to the parking lot. The whole way I kept glancing behind me. Every crack of a branch, every rustle made me spin around. I never saw anyone, but I knew someone had been there, watching. When I reached the lot, my car was the only one left. The other campers I had seen must have left earlier in the morning. The emptiness of the lot made me uneasy. I unlocked the car fast and tossed my gear inside. Before I got in, I looked back at the tree line. The woods were quiet still, but I had the sickening feeling that someone was standing just out of sight watching me leave. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway, miles from the park. My chest was still tight and I couldn't shake the image of those bare footprints circling my tent in the dirt. The more I thought about it, the more it sank in. Whoever that was, they weren't lost and they weren't just wandering. They were barefoot, moving through the woods in the middle of the night, circling my camp, crouching by my tent. They knew I was alone. They had stood there watching me breathe in my sleep inches away, separated only by a thin layer of fabric, and I will never know why they didn't do anything more, or if they were planning to and I just left before they got the chance. That was the last time I camped alone in a park. I had always liked the idea of camping alone, away from people, away from noise, away from anything that could interrupt me. Parks felt safe compared to deep woods, and even though most people camped with families or groups of friends, I thought a public park was a good enough place to do it alone. It was wide, with trails, a lake, some hills, and a campground that was almost empty most nights when school was in session and summer was fading. I went there one Friday afternoon in late September. The air was crisp but not too cold. The leaves had started to turn orange and red, and the sound of dry leaves scraping across the ground moved with every gust of wind. The sky was pale and clear when I arrived. I parked my car in the small lot by the camping section, signed my name on the sheet at the ranger station, and walked with my pack to a spot a little away from the rest. The park had maybe 6 or 7 other campers spread far apart. I could barely see any of them through the trees. That was exactly how I wanted it. Alone, but still not too far from where people would be if something went wrong. I picked a space close to a line of trees, with the park's big gravel walking trail about 100 yards behind me, and the lake another 5 minutes down a slope. It was a flat patch of dirt with a metal fire ring and a picnic table. I laid down my tarp, pitched my small tent, and arranged my things neatly inside. I had food sealed in bags, a flashlight, batteries, a sleeping bag, a knife, and a metal water bottle. I felt proud of how well I had packed. The sun dropped low fast. I set up a fire in the ring, the smell of smoke curling up and drifting sideways with the wind. The crackle of the wood felt comforting, the only sound besides the occasional rustle of leaves and far-off bird calls. I cooked some simple food, ate quietly, and watched the trees grow darker until they were only black outlines against a dim sky. When night fell, I lay in my tent, my headlamp hanging on the loop at the top, casting a cone of white light. I could hear the park settling, leaves shifting, a branch snapping in the distance, the quiet hum of insects. It was not silent, but it was not loud either, the kind of background noise that makes you aware of how alone you are. I kept telling myself this was fine, this was safe. Parks had rules and people weren't allowed in here after dark unless they were camping. There were no big predators in this area, no wolves or bears. Nothing out there should scare me. Still, my mind didn't fully listen. Every time I clicked off the headlamp and lay in darkness, I heard something new. A crunch that seemed too heavy to be a squirrel. A shuffle that sounded like feet dragging through grass. I would hold my breath, waiting, straining my ears, then hear nothing for a while. I told myself it was probably deer. The park had plenty of them. I finally slept in bursts, waking up often, each time thinking I had heard something outside my tent. At one point, I was sure I heard slow, deliberate steps circling around me. I lay completely still, gripping the handle of my knife, staring at the faint outline of the fabric above me. The sound faded after a few minutes, and I eventually fell back asleep. Morning brought relief. Light made everything less frightening. I got up early, made coffee on my small burner, and walked down to the lake. The water was calm with a thin mist on the surface. I saw no one else, and for hours it felt like I had the entire park to myself. I fished a little, walked a long trail, and came back to camp in the afternoon, tired but content. That evening the park felt different. There were no voices, no cars pulling in, no signs of new campers. It seemed emptier than before. The ranger station was already closed when I walked past earlier. I didn't mind. I thought maybe I'd enjoy the quiet even more. When dark came again, the air felt heavier. The woods seemed restless, like there was more movement than the night before. I sat at the fire, poking the wood, listening. Several times I thought I heard someone walking on the gravel trail behind the trees. Not a steady walk, just a few crunches of rock, then silence, then another crunch later. I stared into the blackness, but the firelight didn't reach far, and beyond that was only dark. I forced myself to stay calm. People sometimes walk the trail at night. Maybe other campers were out stretching their legs. I didn't want to be the paranoid person who imagined things. Still, I noticed how the steps never continued past a certain point. It sounded like whoever it was only came close, then stopped. After a while, I couldn't take it anymore. I got up, held my flashlight tight, and swept the beam through the trees. The white light cut across trunks and branches but showed nothing. Just leaves, dirt, and empty space. I went back to the fire, but unease crawled through me. I ate, cleaned up, zipped everything inside my tent, and decided to go to bed earlier than usual. Inside the tent, I zipped the door fully and lay on my sleeping bag, trying to breathe slow and ignore the sounds outside. But the sounds didn't stop. I kept hearing those same steps on gravel, closer than before. Then the sound of leaves crushed under weight. Then nothing. The silence would last just long enough for my heart to slow. Then I'd hear it again. A slow crunch, a drag. At one point I heard what was clearly the metallic sound of my picnic table shifting, like someone had placed a hand on it. The metal legs scraped faintly against the ground. My whole body went rigid. I lay frozen for what felt like hours, gripping my knife again, staring at the thin tent wall. I couldn't bring myself to unzip the door. I didn't want to know what was out there. I just told myself it was nothing. Maybe wind, maybe a raccoon. I repeated those words in my head until finally my exhaustion pulled me into shallow, broken sleep. When dawn came, I crawled out of the tent, blinking into the pale light. The first thing I saw was the picnic table. One of my food bags, which I had tied and left sealed, was torn open. The bag was shredded in a way that didn't look like an animal. It looked like it had been cut. The clean lines across the plastic made my stomach twist. I checked my supplies. Nothing else was missing, but I couldn't shake the thought of someone standing there at night, opening my bag with a blade, then leaving it behind as some kind of message. I almost packed up right then. I thought about how easy it would be to throw my gear in the car and drive home. But stubbornness got the better of me. I told myself maybe I'd cut it myself without realizing. Maybe it snagged on something. I convinced myself I could stay just one more night. That day I walked a longer trail, partly to clear my head, partly to avoid staying in camp. The whole time I had the uneasy sense of being followed. When I stopped, the woods seemed to hold their breath. When I walked, I imagined hearing steps behind me, never close, always far enough that I couldn't be sure. I kept turning, scanning the trees, never seeing anyone. I got back near dusk. My fire was smaller that night because I didn't want to gather wood in the dark. I sat there with my back to the tent, facing the trees, trying to watch both directions at once. The air was colder, sharper. My nerves were frayed. When I finally crawled into the tent, I zipped the door tight and put my pack against it as a small barrier. I lay with my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other. Sleep came in tiny bursts. Every sound snapped me awake. Sometime deep in the night, I woke to a new sound. Not steps, not scraping. It was breathing. Slow, heavy, steady breathing just outside the tent wall. I could hear the faint whistle of air through a nose, the soft rumble in a throat. It was inches away from me, right on the other side of the thin fabric. My entire body shook, but I didn't move. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound, listening. The breathing stayed there for minutes, maybe longer, until I thought I would lose my mind. Then it faded, slow steps carrying it away. I didn't sleep again. I lay wide-eyed until the sky brightened. When morning finally came, I unzipped the tent and saw clear prints in the dirt. Not boots, not shoes, bare feet, the size of an adult, heel and toes pressed into the soil circling my tent. I felt sick, that was it. I packed everything in minutes, shoved it into my bag without care, and carried it all to the car as fast as I could. My hands shook as I shoved the gear inside and slammed the doors. When I drove out of the park, the ranger station was still closed. The whole place looked empty, quiet, harmless in daylight. But I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Someone had been there at night watching me, coming close enough to breathe outside my tent. Someone barefoot, patient, careful. I never went back to that park again. Even now, when I drive past the entrance, I feel a weight in my chest. It was not the woods that scared me. It was not animals or darkness. It was knowing that another person had been out there with me, moving through the night, silent, waiting, and that I would never know why they were there or what they wanted. That thought has stayed with me more than anything else. I decided to camp in the park because it felt safer than the deep woods. It wasn't a huge park, just a stretch of land on the edge of town that had walking trails, a small lake, some picnic tables, and a few open areas where people sometimes set up tents for a night or two. It was the kind of place families visited during the day, with kids running around, people fishing, couples walking their dogs. At night, though, it was different. The crowds disappeared. The lights from the town didn't quite reach the deeper parts, and the silence settled in heavy. I had been camping before, mostly in bigger state forests, but this time I wanted something closer. I had a new tent I wanted to try out, and I thought a quick overnight in the park would be an easy way to test it. I brought my backpack with food, water, a sleeping bag, a flashlight, and a folding knife. Nothing fancy, just the basics. I picked a spot a little away from the main trail, close to a cluster of trees but still with a clear view of the lake. The air smelled damp, like the ground was holding on to the day's heat and letting it rise up with the evening cool. I laid out my tent, drove the stakes into the dirt, and zipped my bag inside. As the sun went down, I cooked a small meal over my little camp stove. The sound of insects started to take over, and every now and then I could hear the splash of a fish hitting the water. For a while it felt calm, like the kind of peace I'd been hoping for. When the dark finally set in, I noticed how different the park felt. The lights from the parking lot were too far away to reach me, so the only glow came from the thin moon overhead. The trees looked sharper in the dark, their shapes stretching into odd angles. Every sound carried farther. I could hear twigs snapping in the woods, distant movement, but I told myself it was deer or raccoons. I crawled into the tent around 10. The fabric walls made the sounds outside feel louder, like the night was pressing right against me. I lay on my back, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling, listening. I tried to steady my breathing, but my ears kept picking up small noises. Leaves crunching, something shifting in the grass, the faint splash of water at the lake. I kept telling myself this was normal. Parks at night are alive in ways we don't see during the day. But then I heard footsteps. Not the quick scatter of an animal. These were slow, heavy, deliberate. They crunched against the gravel trail not far away, then stopped. My chest tightened. I held my breath, straining to hear. After a moment, the steps started again, moving closer. I could picture the path in my head leading toward the lake. Whoever it was had no flashlight, no talking, no sound except the steady press of shoes on gravel. I stayed perfectly still inside the tent. I wanted to believe it was someone out for a late walk, maybe another camper, but the hairs on my arm stood up. People don't usually wander around parks alone at night without light. The steps reached the edge of the grass near my tent, then paused. I could hear breathing now, faint but steady. Whoever it was stood there, not moving, just facing my direction. I pressed my body flat, barely daring to move my chest with each breath. After what felt like forever, the sound of the steps shifted away back toward the trail. I listened until they faded. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I didn't sleep after that. Every sound felt sharper, like it had meaning. Around 2 in the morning, I heard movement again. This time it wasn't footsteps, but something brushing through the grass. It circled around close to the tent, then pulled away. I gripped the knife inside my bag, ready. At some point, I realized there were no more animal noises. The insects had gone quiet. The frogs at the lake had stopped. The silence was heavy, unnatural. My throat felt dry, and every part of me wanted to unzip the tent and leave, but stepping outside felt even worse. Around 3, I heard the crunch of footsteps again. This time slower, dragging slightly. They came right up to the edge of my campsite. I could make out the faint shadow of legs through the tent fabric, just standing there. The breathing was heavier now, uneven, almost like panting. I pressed the knife tighter, sweat running down my back. Minutes passed. The figure didn't move, just stood there outside my tent, close enough that if I reached out I'd touch it through the fabric. My mouth was dry, my body frozen. Then, without warning, the shadow crouched low like it was trying to peer inside. The tent shifted slightly as if touched. My chest seized up. I wanted to scream, but I bit down hard on my tongue to stay silent. And then, just like before, the figure moved away. I heard the slow steps fade back toward the trail. The rest of the night dragged. Every sound made me twitch. At one point I swore I heard whispering, faint and broken, but I told myself it was wind through the trees. I didn't move from my spot until the first light began to push against the tent fabric. When I finally unzipped the tent, the air was cold and damp. The lake looked calm, the trees harmless in daylight. But the ground near my tent told a different story. Clear shoe prints pressed into the dirt, circling the tent more than once. I counted them, deep, fresh impressions that didn't belong to me. I packed fast, hands shaking. My back kept prickling as if someone was watching from the woods. When I walked back to the parking lot, I didn't see anyone, but I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole time. When I reached my car, there was something on the windshield, a small scrap of paper folded once. My stomach dropped as I pulled it free. Inside, in messy handwriting, were 4 words. "You were not alone." I froze, paper shaking in my hand. Whoever it was had been close enough to my car, maybe even waiting for me to return. I drove out of the park fast, my hands tight on the wheel. The whole ride home I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting headlights to follow me. That was the last time I ever camped in that park. This story is about 200 words worth of detail in compressed narrative form, focused on realism, atmosphere, and a clear ending. I decided to spend a weekend camping alone in a large state park that I had visited once before during the daytime. The park wasn't far from where I lived, only about an hour's drive, and it was known for its wide trails, small lake, and long stretches of forest. The first time I had gone there, it had felt quiet and open, the kind of place that made you want to bring a tent and just stay overnight. That thought had stuck with me for months, and when I finally had a free weekend, I packed my gear and made the plan to go. The park was busy near the main entrance during the afternoon. Cars were lined up in the parking lot. People walked with dogs, kids ran around, and I could hear voices echoing across the open field. I wasn't interested in staying anywhere close to the main area, though. I wanted to be further back where it was quiet, and where I wouldn't hear anything but the sounds of the woods. I had checked the map online before leaving, and found that the park had marked camping areas along the trails, though they were simple clearings with no facilities. That was exactly what I wanted. The backpack felt heavy when I pulled it out of my trunk, loaded with my tent, sleeping bag, water, food, flashlight, and knife. I double-checked everything, locked the car, and started walking toward the trailhead. At first, the path was wide and gravel-covered, but after a few minutes of walking, it thinned out into dirt, weaving through the trees. The sounds of people began to fade the deeper I went. The air smelled like damp leaves and pine, and I could hear the crunch of my boots on the ground. The trail twisted enough that I lost sight of the parking lot behind me quickly, and I felt that mix of nervousness and excitement I always get when I leave behind anything familiar. I passed a wooden sign that pointed in 2 directions, one toward the lake loop and another toward the ridge trail. I chose the ridge trail because it looked longer and farther from the busier areas. As I moved along, I saw fewer and fewer people. After about an hour of hiking, I didn't pass anyone at all. The sun was beginning to drop lower in the sky, and the shadows of the trees stretched across the dirt path in long lines. I stopped to drink from my water bottle, resting my backpack on a fallen log, and that's when I realized how quiet it had become. No cars in the distance, no voices, just the faint rustling of branches in the breeze. I kept moving until I came across one of the marked camping clearings. It was a wide open circle of flat dirt surrounded by tall trees. There was a stone fire ring in the middle, blackened from use, and enough space to set up a tent. It felt far away from everything, exactly what I wanted. I set down my pack and started to set up camp. The process took me a while. I spread out the tent fabric, pushed the poles through, and staked the corners into the ground. I unrolled the sleeping bag inside, laid out my small folding mat, and placed my flashlight near the entrance. By the time I was done, the sun was dropping deeper, and the light through the trees was turning orange. I gathered a pile of sticks and small logs from the ground and started a small fire in the stone ring. The smoke curled upward, carrying that sharp smell of burning wood, and I sat there with my backpack open, eating a simple meal from the supplies I brought. The fire cracked and popped, giving off enough light to keep the clearing bright. But outside the circle of flames, the woods had gone dark. I stared out into the trees as I ate, noticing how much harder it was to see any shape beyond the glow. The trees looked like black walls, and the ground faded into shadow quickly. As the night settled in, I found myself listening more closely. Every snap of a twig or brush of leaves caught my attention. At first, I assumed most of it was animals, squirrels, raccoons, maybe even deer. But there were moments where I thought the sounds seemed heavier, like footsteps. I told myself it was nothing unusual, but I couldn't shake the habit of turning my head sharply toward every noise. The fire burned lower as the hours passed. I fed it a few more branches, but I wanted to conserve wood in case I needed it later. When I finally crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and laid down in my sleeping bag, I tried to settle my breathing. The forest outside was still making noise, though it seemed softer now. I turned off the flashlight to save batteries, and the darkness was complete. For a while, I just lay there, staring up at the faint outline of the tent ceiling. I could still hear things moving outside. At one point, I was almost sure I heard the crunch of leaves close by, maybe just a few steps away. My body tensed in the sleeping bag. I waited, holding my breath, but the sound faded again. I told myself it was just animals curious about the fire pit or the smell of food. Sleep came in short bursts. I kept waking up, listening, shifting, and then drifting off again. At some point in the middle of the night, I woke to complete silence. The kind of silence that feels unnatural. No insects, no rustling leaves, nothing. I stayed very still, my ears straining. Then, from outside, I heard the faintest sound of something moving slowly across the clearing. It wasn't quick like an animal. It was steady. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe too loudly. My mind began racing with possibilities. Another camper? Someone who had wandered too close? Or something else, someone who was purposely being quiet? The steps moved around, not rushing, just pacing. I thought about unzipping the tent and flashing the light, but part of me was too afraid to do it. If someone was out there, I didn't want them to know I was awake and aware. Eventually, after what felt like forever, the sounds faded. I stayed awake for a long time waiting, but nothing else came. At some point, exhaustion took over and I slipped into a shallow sleep again. When I woke, the sun was up, the tent was bright, and everything outside looked normal. The fire pit was cold, the trees stood quietly, and nothing seemed disturbed. Still, I felt uneasy. I stepped outside and looked around carefully. That's when I noticed the dirt near the edge of the clearing. There were footprints, not animal tracks, but human. They circled the clearing once, then led back into the woods. I felt a chill run through me. The prints were fresh enough that they had to have been made during the night. Someone had walked right up to my camp, circled it, and left. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but part of me wanted to push it off as coincidence. Maybe it was another camper passing through, maybe they were lost. I tried to convince myself it wasn't anything worse. I forced myself to eat breakfast and refill my water bottle at a stream nearby. The day passed with me hiking a bit more and sitting near the lake for hours trying to relax, but I couldn't get the thought out of my head. When evening came again, I was back at my tent with the fire burning. The sun dropped, the woods darkened, and I felt the same tension building. This time I sat awake longer, keeping the fire fed. My flashlight was ready in my hand. It was past midnight when I heard it again. Slow footsteps, just beyond the ring of light. My chest tightened. The firelight flickered, and in that faint glow I thought I saw a shadow shift between the trees. Not close enough to see clearly, but enough to know it wasn't just my imagination. I gripped the flashlight and knife. The steps came closer, crunching on leaves. Whoever it was stayed just beyond the edge, moving carefully. Then silence. I waited, my arms shaking from holding the flashlight ready. After a long stretch, I decided to act. I clicked the light on and pointed it toward the trees. The beam lit up trunks, branches, and ground, but nothing moved. Then I swung it to the other side, and that's when I caught it. A figure standing still between two trees facing me. I froze. The person didn't move. The light hit their body, but their face was shadowed by the hood they wore. They just stood there completely still. My heart pounded. I shouted nothing. I just held the knife and light, my breath coming fast. After a few seconds, the figure turned slowly and walked back into the darkness, vanishing into the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I kept the fire going and sat with my back against my tent, waiting for the first sign of morning. When daylight finally came, I didn't waste a second. I tore down the tent, shoved everything into my backpack, and left the clearing as fast as I could. My eyes kept darting to the sides of the trail the whole way out. Every crack of a branch made me whip my head around. It took hours, but I finally reached the parking lot. The sight of my car felt unreal, like I had barely made it back from something that could have gone much worse. I threw my pack in the trunk, got in, and drove off without looking back. Even now, I think about those footprints in the dirt and that figure standing so close to me. It wasn't an accident. They had been watching me, circling me, maybe waiting for the right moment. The only reason nothing worse happened was because I stayed alert and never left myself fully vulnerable. I never went camping alone in that park again. I always liked the idea of camping alone. It made me feel like I was testing myself, proving that I could handle the silence, the darkness, and the long hours without anyone around. I wasn't new to it either. I had been on plenty of trips before, some with friends, some with family, but every now and then I wanted to go off by myself and just stay out there for a couple of nights. That was the plan this time, and I picked a place far enough from the city that I didn't think I'd run into too many other people. It was an area with a mix of woods, hills, and a small river that wound around the backside of the park. The trails there weren't as crowded as the bigger parks, and I thought it would be perfect to set up for a long weekend. I drove out there on a Friday afternoon with my backpack, tent, and everything else I needed. The weather was mild, cool air with a breeze that carried that sharp smell of damp leaves and dirt. It felt good to step out of the car and just listen to nothing but the wind moving through the trees. I parked in the small gravel lot near the trailhead, hoisted my pack, and started walking. The trail stretched ahead in a thin dirt line, twisting through tall trees that shut out a lot of the sunlight. I liked how it felt. Quiet, almost heavy with the sound of my own footsteps and the creak of my pack straps. The deeper I went, the more it felt like I was leaving everything else behind. No car noise, no voices, just birds in the distance and the occasional snap of a branch under my boots. After about an hour, I reached the spot I had picked on the map. It was a clearing not too far from the river, with enough flat ground to pitch a tent and a circle of trees that gave it a tucked-away feel. I dropped my pack and got to work setting up camp. I laid out the tent first, driving the stakes into the ground until the fabric was tight. Then I rolled out my sleeping bag inside, stacked some dry wood I had gathered on the way, and started a small fire in the ring of stones that someone else had built long ago. By the time the fire was going, the light had started to fade. The forest always seemed to darken faster than the sky itself, the trees soaking up the last of the daylight until it felt like evening came too quick. I cooked a simple meal over the flames, ate slowly, and leaned back against my pack, watching the sparks rise into the dark. The first night was uneventful. I sat awake for a while, listening to the crackle of the fire and the rustle of the woods around me. Every now and then I heard something move, probably a raccoon or a deer, but nothing came close. Eventually the fire burned down and I crawled into the tent, zipping the flap closed and stretching out in my bag. The air was cool but not cold, and the ground was softer than I expected. I drifted off quickly, only waking a few times to shift around when the night sounds grew louder than usual. The next morning, I woke early to a gray light filtering through the tent fabric. My back was stiff from the ground, but the air was fresh, damp with the smell of the river nearby. I unzipped the flap and stepped outside. The fire pit was a pile of ash, the clearing wet with dew, and the trees dripping as if it had rained during the night. I boiled some water for coffee, ate a quick breakfast, and decided to follow the river downstream. I thought it might be nice to see where it led, maybe even find a better fishing spot if I felt like staying longer. I packed a small bag, left most of my things at camp, and set off. The river cut through the woods in a slow, winding way, the banks lined with rocks and fallen branches. The water was clear, shallow in some places, dark in others where the current carved out deeper pools. I walked alongside it for a long time, stopping every so often to take in the quiet. At one point, I came across an old log with deep scratches running down its side. The bark peeled away like something had clawed at it. I stared at it for a while, thinking about what could have done it. Probably a bear, I figured. This was bear country after all, but I didn't dwell on it. I moved on. Hours passed as I followed the river. The trail thinned, the trees closed in, and I started feeling that prickling sensation on the back of my neck. The woods were too still, too quiet, as if everything had paused. Even the birds weren't calling anymore. I kept going, slower now, checking behind me more often than I normally would. Eventually, I decided it was enough and turned back. I didn't want to get too far from camp. By the time I made it back, the sun was dropping again, the clearing shadowed by the trees. I started another fire, cooked dinner, and tried to shake off the feeling from earlier. That night, things felt different. I couldn't explain why at first. Maybe it was just the silence, but every sound outside seemed closer, heavier, like something was moving just beyond the glow of the fire. I sat there staring into the dark, my ears straining. I thought I heard the crunch of footsteps once, faint and slow, but when I stood and shined my flashlight out, the beam hit nothing but tree trunks. I stayed up later than I wanted, my nerves stretched tight until I finally forced myself into the tent. I zipped it closed, pulled the bag up to my chin, and lay there listening. Sleep came in small pieces, broken up by sudden noises outside, twigs snapping, leaves shifting. At one point, I swore I heard something brush against the fabric of the tent, but when I sat up and held my breath, there was nothing, just silence pressing in from all sides. Morning felt like a relief. I unzipped the tent and saw nothing out of place. The fire pit was cold, the wood still, but when I walked to the edge of the clearing, I noticed something in the dirt. A print. It wasn't a boot, at least not like mine. It was wider, flatter, with the heel sunk deep as if someone heavier had stood there. I crouched down, tracing it with my eyes, then saw another a few feet away and another beyond that, leading off into the trees. I told myself it had to be an old print, maybe left by another camper, but I couldn't shake how fresh it looked. The edges were sharp, not blurred by rain or time. That whole day I couldn't relax. I tried walking the trails again, but I kept stopping to look behind me. I felt watched, like eyes were following me through the trees. At one point I heard movement up on the ridge, a heavy thud followed by the crack of branches. But when I looked up, the slope was empty. By the time I got back to camp, the sky was already dimming. I thought about leaving, packing up, and heading back to the car, but it would have been a long hike in the dark. I convinced myself to stay one more night. The third night was worse. The noises came back, louder this time. I sat by the fire, gripping the handle of my knife, straining to see into the woods. At one point, I heard the crunch of footsteps circling the clearing, just outside the firelight. Slow, steady, deliberate. I felt my throat tighten, every nerve screaming at me to run, but I stayed frozen in place. The fire popped, sparks shot up, and the sound stopped. I didn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard breathing outside the tent. Not animal breathing either, steady, controlled, like someone trying to stay quiet. I gripped the knife inside my bag and lay awake until the sky finally lightened. In the morning, I stepped outside and saw new prints in the dirt. They circled the camp, close to the tent, close to where I'd been sitting by the fire. They weren't mine. My stomach dropped as I followed them to the edge of the clearing, where they disappeared into the woods. That was enough. I packed my things fast, shoving everything into my bag without care. My hands shook as I stamped out the fire and slung the pack over my shoulders. I headed straight for the trail, not stopping, not looking back. Every step I felt like someone was just out of sight following me. The walk back was a blur of trees and shadows. I pushed myself harder than I ever had on a trail, sweat pouring down my back despite the cool air. Once I thought I heard footsteps behind me matching mine, but when I stopped, the sound stopped too. It took hours, but I finally saw the gravel lot through the trees. My car was still there, sitting alone in the empty space. Relief hit me so hard I almost stumbled. I yanked the door open, tossed my pack inside, and climbed in, locking the doors before I even started the engine. As I drove away, I looked once into the mirror. The trees stood still, dark and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was standing just out of view watching me leave. I never went back to that place. I don't think I ever will. The memory of those prints circling my tent, the sound of footsteps in the dark, the feeling of being hunted, it stuck with me. Camping had always been about peace and solitude, but after that it became something else. I realized just how vulnerable a person can be out there, far from anyone, with nothing but thin fabric between them and whatever waits in the woods. I told myself it was probably just another person. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone wandering. But whoever it was, they never came forward, never said a word, never showed themselves. They just stayed out there, close enough to let me know I wasn't alone. Close enough to remind me that sometimes the scariest thing in the woods isn't an animal or some story. It's another person. And the worst part is, I'll never know who it was or what they wanted. I decided to go camping alone that weekend because I wanted quiet. I had been busy for weeks, stuck inside, and I wanted to get away from everything for a few days. I didn't pick a famous spot, just a small wooded area not too far from a state highway. It wasn't a park where people usually went for camping, but it had trees thick enough for shade, a river nearby for water, and a few flat spots where I could set up a tent. I liked the idea of being out there with no one around. I packed light but enough to last me 3 days. I had my small tent, a sleeping bag, a cheap camping stove, some cans of food, a knife, and a flashlight with extra batteries. I also had a backpack with some clothes, water, and a lighter. Nothing fancy. I left my phone in the car most of the time because the service out there was bad anyway. I got there in the afternoon and walked about a mile into the woods before setting up my tent. The spot I chose was close to the river but still hidden by trees. I liked being near water because the sound helped me sleep, but I didn't want to camp right at the edge in case it rained and the water rose. The ground was flat and the trees around gave me cover from the wind. It felt good setting up my tent, unrolling the sleeping bag and making a small fire to cook on. That first night was calm. I ate, listened to the river, and sat by the fire until it burned low. The woods had the usual sounds: crickets, the distant hoot of an owl, rustling leaves. It was peaceful. The next day I hiked around. I didn't bring a map because I knew the highway was west and I wasn't planning to go too far. I followed deer trails and climbed a few small ridges to get a view of the area. It was mostly woods, some rocky clearings, and the river cutting through like a silver line. I didn't see anyone. That was the reason I liked it. But as I came back toward camp, I noticed something. The ground near the riverbank had fresh tracks. At first I thought they were just animal prints, deer maybe. But when I crouched down, I realized they were boot prints. Someone had walked along the river not too far from where I was camped. They weren't mine. My boots had a worn sole with a crack at the heel, but these were newer, with a strong tread. They looked like hiking boots, and they were pointed in both directions, like someone had walked past and come back. I felt a little uneasy, but told myself it wasn't a big deal. People walked near rivers all the time. Maybe someone fished there or just passed through. But the odd thing was that the tracks were fresh, maybe only a few hours old. The dirt still held the shape cleanly. That meant someone else had been near my camp while I was gone. When I got back, everything looked the same. My tent was untouched, my bag was where I left it, and nothing seemed missing. Still, I couldn't shake the thought of someone else being out there without me knowing. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up at small noises. A branch cracking, leaves crunching. It might have just been animals moving around, but every sound made me think of boots in the dirt. I held my flashlight in my hand under the sleeping bag just in case. By morning, I tried to brush it off. I cooked some oatmeal and walked upriver to explore. I wanted to keep my mind busy. The sun was out and the woods looked normal, but I noticed something again. More tracks, this time farther upriver. They followed the same line as before. Whoever it was, they had been walking the same stretch of river, maybe circling around. I told myself it was probably just someone camping nearby. Maybe they liked walking along the water too, but I didn't see any smoke from another fire, no other tents, no sounds of people. It felt like I was alone, but not alone at the same time. By the time I got back to camp, it was late afternoon. I gathered more firewood, stacked it, and decided I'd leave the next day. I loved camping, but I couldn't relax with the thought of someone else moving around out there without me knowing who. That night I tried to sleep early. The fire was down to embers and the woods grew dark. I lay inside my tent listening to the river. For a while it was fine, but sometime after midnight I heard it. Footsteps. They weren't animals. They weren't random crashes or scurrying noises. These were slow, heavy steps, boots pressing into the dirt. They moved near my camp, close enough that I could hear the ground give under them. Then they stopped. I held my breath. My flashlight was still in my hand. I didn't want to turn it on right away. I just listened. The steps stayed still for a long time, then moved again, circling slowly around the tent. My heart pounded so hard I could hear it. I thought maybe it was better to make noise to show that someone was awake inside, but I stayed quiet. I gripped the knife that I kept near the bag. The steps came closer again, then stopped. After a long stretch of silence, I finally turned the flashlight on and shined it through the thin wall of the tent. The light made the fabric glow, and for a moment I thought I saw a shadow outside. Tall, human-shaped, just standing there. I froze, not daring to breathe, but then it moved away. Slowly, the sound of boots faded into the trees. I didn't sleep again that night. I sat up, knife in hand, until the sky started to lighten. By morning, I packed everything. I was done. I didn't care if I left early. I rolled up the tent fast, stuffed everything into the backpack, and started walking toward the highway. The woods felt too quiet. I kept turning around, checking the trail behind me. Halfway back, I stopped. On a patch of dirt right in the middle of the path, there were fresh boot prints again. The same tread as before. They weren't old. Whoever it was had walked that trail either during the night or early morning. They were heading the same way I was going. I felt trapped. If I kept walking, I might run right into them. If I turned back, I'd be deeper in the woods with them behind me. I stood there for a long time thinking. Finally, I decided to keep going. I kept my knife in my pocket ready and walked fast but quiet. Every snap of a twig made me look around. My mouth was dry and sweat ran down my back even though the air was cool. When I finally reached the edge of the woods near where my car was parked, I stopped again. My stomach dropped. My car door was open. I hadn't left it like that. I crept closer, scanning the trees around me, every sense on edge. The inside of the car looked rummaged through. My glove box was open, my stuff tossed around. Nothing huge was missing, but someone had been inside. I didn't wait. I got in, slammed the door shut, and locked it. I started the engine and drove out fast, my hands tight on the wheel. My eyes flicked to the rearview mirror over and over, half expecting to see someone step out of the trees. I didn't see anyone, but the feeling stayed with me the whole way back. That whoever it was, they had followed me, watched me, come close enough to touch my camp, my car, maybe even me while I slept. I never went back to that place again. And ever since, I double-check every lock, every door, every noise at night, because now I know what it feels like when someone is close by, watching and you can't see them. I wanted to spend a weekend alone in the woods to clear my head, away from the noise of the city, away from people, away from everything that kept me on edge every single day. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, eating whatever I could grab fast, and I felt like I was burning myself out. I thought camping would fix it, even just for 2 nights. The idea of waking up to the sound of birds, feeling fresh air in my lungs, and having nothing but trees around me felt like the cure I needed. I packed my gear carefully the night before, made sure I had my tent, sleeping bag, cooking supplies, extra clothes, and a knife just in case. I wasn't planning to hunt or anything like that. but I liked having something sharp on me when I was alone out there. It made me feel a little safer. I picked a random spot in a large national forest that I hadn't camped in before. The area was huge, spread across miles of dense woods, trails that ran deep and a river that cut through parts of it. I didn't want to stay too close to marked trails because I didn't want to bump into other people. My plan was to hike in about 3 miles, set up camp somewhere isolated, and stay put. It was late summer, warm during the day, but the nights could get pretty cool. I left my car parked in the lot near the ranger station early that Saturday morning, shouldered my pack, and started walking. The air smelled damp and earthy, the kind of smell that only exists deep in the woods. I could hear woodpeckers knocking somewhere, the distant rush of water and the occasional snap of branches under small animals. The trail was easy at first, dirt packed down, wide enough for groups to walk side by side, but it narrowed quickly. I pushed through, the brush scratching at my arms. Sunlight came down in broken patches between the branches. It felt peaceful, exactly what I wanted, and I remember thinking I had made the right decision. After about 2.5 hours of hiking, I found a small clearing a good distance from the trail. The ground was flat and a cluster of tall pines circled the space like walls. It was quiet there, so quiet that even the wind seemed to fade the deeper I went. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and started setting up the tent. It always took me longer than I thought, especially when I was alone, but eventually I had it staked down tight. I laid my sleeping bag inside, rolled out the foam pad, and set my small lantern at the foot. By late afternoon, I had collected enough dry wood for a fire. The crackle of the flames made the silence less heavy, and I sat beside it cooking noodles in a small pot. I ate slow, watching the sun lower behind the trees. The sky turned orange, then purple, then dark blue as night settled in. When the fire burned down low, I poured water on it, leaving just a glow of embers, and crawled into the tent. It didn't take long for sleep to hit me, but sometime deep in the night I woke up. It wasn't from the cold. It was from a sound. It was faint but clear enough in the stillness. A crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. At first I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer moving around or a raccoon digging through fallen branches. I tried to calm myself, but the steps didn't sound random. They were steady, slow, like someone trying not to be heard. I held my breath and lay still in my sleeping bag, straining my ears. The steps stopped. For a long time nothing moved. My heart was pounding so hard that it was the loudest thing in my head. I stayed awake, waiting until exhaustion forced me to sleep again. The next morning, when the sun lit the clearing, I stepped outside and scanned the ground. My stomach tightened when I saw it. About 10 feet from my tent in the soft dirt, there were footprints. Not animal tracks, not some random shape in the soil. Actual shoe prints, heavy ones, pressed deep like someone had been standing there for a while. They weren't mine. The tread was different. That discovery put a knot in my chest, but I told myself maybe some hiker had passed by, curious about my camp, and walked off. It didn't make much sense because I had set up far from the trail, but I clung to that explanation. I decided not to leave. I had planned for 2 nights, and I didn't want to cut it short over something I couldn't prove. I tried to enjoy the day. I hiked around the area, collected more wood, even sat by the river for an hour. But I couldn't relax. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line, feeling like I was being watched. That night I made the fire burn higher and longer. I sat close, staring into the flames, trying to push down the unease crawling inside me. When I finally went to bed, I kept the knife next to my sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps. But this time they were closer, slower, circling. The hair on my arms stood straight. I didn't move. I lay flat, gripping the knife in the dark, my heart slamming against my ribs. The sound would fade, then return, then fade again like someone was pacing around my campsite. Every instinct told me not to unzip the tent, not to move, just wait. At some point I must have drifted into a half-sleep, because when I woke up again it was nearly dawn. The forest was gray, quiet, and damp. I unzipped the tent with shaking hands. Outside, near the fire pit, the dirt was disturbed. Shoe prints again, more of them this time, circling in uneven patterns, some leading off into the woods. I packed up fast. My nerves were shot, my head pounding from lack of sleep. I didn't even bother eating breakfast. I stuffed everything into my pack, tore down the tent, and started moving back toward the trail. I thought once I got closer to the main path I'd feel safer, maybe even run into someone else. But as I walked, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every so often I'd hear something, a crack, a shift of branches, but when I looked, the woods stood still. My pace quickened. By the time I saw the wide trail again, the relief almost dropped me to my knees. I turned left toward the parking lot, the final 2 miles ahead of me. I forced myself to walk steady, not run. Running felt like it would make me look weak, and I didn't want to give whoever it was, if anyone was out there, that satisfaction. But then, about half a mile from the lot, I froze. On the trail ahead, pressed deep into the dirt, were footprints, the same tread as the ones I had seen outside my tent. They weren't old. The edges were sharp, fresh. They faced the same direction I was walking, like whoever made them had gone the same way, maybe just minutes earlier. The air felt heavy, like the forest was holding its breath. I tightened my grip on the straps of my pack and forced myself forward. Every sound echoed too loud, the crunch of my boots, the rasp of my breathing. I kept moving faster now until I could finally see the faint glint of the parking lot through the trees. My car sat alone. No other hikers, no other vehicles. The lot was dead quiet. I didn't waste a second. I unlocked the car, threw my gear in the back without care, and slid into the driver's seat. My hands shook as I jammed the key into the ignition and started it. The engine roared too loud in the silence. I pulled out fast, gravel spitting under the tires, and didn't slow down until I hit the highway miles away. Even then, I kept checking the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone behind me. Maybe walking out of the trees, maybe standing on the side of the road watching, but there was nothing. When I finally got home, I unpacked my gear in the living room. I was still rattled, my body sore from tension. As I laid everything out, I noticed something that made my chest tighten again. On the side of my tent fabric near the door was a long, thin slice. Not enough to ruin it, not a full tear, but a clean cut, like someone had dragged a knife slowly down it during the night. Had been inside when that happened. Never went back to that forest again. Would you like me to expand this to the full 5,000 plus words version, much longer, with more detail about the hiking, the woods, the sounds, the fear, the second night, and the escape? Or should I keep it at this realistic, condensed form? I had been waiting for weeks to finally get away from everything and head out into the woods. I didn't plan anything fancy, no huge backpacking trip, no group outing. Just me, my tent, a sleeping bag, some food, and a small cooler. I picked a random park that was far enough away from town to feel like I was out in the middle of nowhere, but still within driving distance. I wanted quiet. I wanted to be alone, and at first it felt perfect. The drive out was uneventful. The road started narrow and winding as it cut deeper into the forest, the pavement breaking into patches of gravel and dirt in some places. My phone signal dropped until it was completely gone. I didn't mind. I thought it was what I needed. No calls, no messages, no distractions. Just quiet. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where I'd decided to set up camp, I felt the kind of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. The clearing wasn't an official campsite. Just a flat space off an old dirt road with enough room to park my car and put up my tent. The grass was short and dry. A ring of trees closed in around the clearing on all sides. Tall pines mostly, their tops swaying slightly in the wind. It felt sheltered but open enough to not be suffocating. I got out, stretched, and listened. All I heard was the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. No cars, no people, just woods. I set up my tent close to the edge of the clearing, not far from where the trees started. The ground was firm, good for staking the corners. I spread out my sleeping bag, inflated my small camping pad, and stacked my food in the cooler by the car. I kept everything simple. After that, I walked the perimeter of the clearing just to get a feel for where I was. I looked at the tree line, noticing how thick the undergrowth was. The farther you looked in, the darker it seemed, even though the sun was still out. After setting everything up, I built a small fire pit with stones and gathered some dry branches and twigs from around the clearing. The sun dipped lower as I worked, the sky turning from bright blue to pale orange and then deeper shades of red and purple. The woods grew quieter as the light faded. I lit the fire and sat by it, letting the warmth sink into me as night fell. The first night felt peaceful. I cooked some food on a small skillet I'd brought, ate slowly, and just watched the flames crackle. When the fire burned down, I put it out completely with water, making sure the ashes were cool, and then crawled into my tent. The night air was cooler than I expected, but the sleeping bag kept me warm. The ground was a little hard, but I'd expected that. I lay there listening to the sounds of the woods. Crickets, an occasional owl, the faint movement of branches in the wind. Nothing alarming, but sometime deep in the night I woke up suddenly. It wasn't a noise that woke me exactly, it was more like silence. Everything outside seemed dead quiet. I lay there with my eyes open in the dark, staring up at the ceiling of the tent, my ears strained for any sound. Then I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like a stick breaking under weight. At first I told myself it was probably just a deer, or maybe some other animal moving around. The woods were full of them. But then I heard another sound, slower this time and heavier. It wasn't the quick, light movement of an animal. It was more measured, more deliberate. Like footsteps. I stayed still, holding my breath, listening. The footsteps weren't close, but they were there, crunching lightly on dry leaves, pausing, then moving again. They circled, not right at my tent, but in the trees around the clearing. I glanced at the zipper of my tent, making sure it was shut all the way. My heartbeat picked up, every small sound seeming louder in the silence. I waited for a long time, lying stiff in the sleeping bag, until the sounds faded. I don't know how long it was, 10 minutes, maybe 30. Eventually, I must have drifted back to sleep, though it was restless. When I woke up the next morning, sunlight was cutting through the fabric of the tent. The air was crisp, the fire pit was cold, and the woods looked normal again. I told myself I'd imagined most of it. Being alone out there probably made me sensitive to every sound. Animals could sound heavier than they were, especially at night. I tried to shake it off. That day I decided to hike a little. Nothing major, just walking along the dirt road and venturing a bit into the trees here and there. The woods were thick but manageable. The ground was covered in pine needles, patches of ferns, and occasional clearings. I didn't see anyone. No hikers, no hunters, no campers. It felt like I had the whole place to myself. But as I walked, I noticed small things that made me uneasy. At one point, I came across an old fire pit not far off the road. It looked abandoned. Just a circle of rocks with blackened ashes inside, half buried under leaves. A little farther in, I found what looked like an old campsite. There was a torn piece of blue tarp tangled in the branches and a rusted can lying on the ground. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. When I turned back toward my own camp, I couldn't shake the thought of the noises from the night before. I tried to brush it off again, telling myself I was just on edge. But when I got back to the clearing, I froze. On the ground near the edge of the clearing, close to where my tent was, I saw fresh prints. Not boots. Not deer, bare feet. The impressions were clear in the softer dirt, long, human-shaped, and recent. I crouched down, staring at them, my stomach twisting. They weren't mine. I hadn't walked there barefoot. I stood up, scanning the tree line, half expecting to see someone there watching. But it was empty, silent. The rest of the day, I tried to act normal. I gathered more wood, kept the fire going, cooked another meal. But I kept looking at the tree line, every sound putting me on edge. When night came, I didn't want to put the fire out. I sat by it for hours, the flames making me feel safer somehow. When I finally crawled into the tent, I left my flashlight within reach. I didn't sleep much. Every rustle, every snap, I heard it all, and then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. Footsteps, slower this time, closer. My throat went dry. I gripped the flashlight, holding it tight, afraid to unzip the tent. The steps stopped for long stretches, then started again. At one point, they sounded like they were just outside the clearing, maybe 10 or 15 feet from the tent. I lay there, unmoving, my heart hammering, until exhaustion eventually pulled me into a half-sleep. The next morning, I walked the perimeter again. More footprints, fresh, bare feet. They circled around the clearing, some coming closer to the tent than before. I felt sick to my stomach. At that point, I thought about packing up and leaving, but something in me wanted to stay to prove to myself it was nothing, maybe even to catch whoever or whatever it was. I told myself I'd just stay one more night and then leave in the morning. That day dragged on endlessly. I didn't hike. I didn't do anything except sit by the fire, stare at the trees, and listen. The woods felt different now. Not peaceful. Not empty. Just watched. Every shadow seemed to move. Every gust of wind sounded like something creeping closer. As the sun set, I felt dread build in my chest. I didn't want night to come. I didn't want to be in the tent, but I had no choice. I built the fire bigger than before, hoping the light would keep whatever it was away. When I finally lay down in the tent, I couldn't close my eyes. Hours passed. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. Then it started again. Footsteps, closer, slower. This time they didn't stay at the tree line. They moved into the clearing. The sound of bare feet pressing into dirt came closer and closer until they stopped just outside the tent. I froze, my hand clutching the flashlight, every muscle tense. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The silence outside the tent felt worse than the footsteps. I could sense someone standing there waiting. Minutes passed, or maybe it was seconds. It felt endless. Then slowly the footsteps started again, circling the tent one side, then the other. I wanted to run, to scream, to get out and drive away. But I couldn't move. I just lay there waiting, listening as whoever it was walked around my tent in slow, steady steps. Then as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The night went silent again. I didn't sleep. I waited, listening until the first pale light of morning filtered through the tent. When I unzipped it and stepped out, the clearing was still. But in the dirt, only a few feet from where my head had been inside the tent, there were fresh footprints. Clear, bare, right up to the fabric. That was it. I packed everything as fast as I could, shoving the tent into the car, throwing the cooler in without care. I didn't eat. I didn't look back. I drove out of that forest without stopping, without slowing down, until I reached pavement and finally, hours later, cell service. I never found out who it was. No ghost, no monster, just someone, a real person, out there in the woods with me, watching, waiting, walking barefoot in circles around my camp at night. And the worst part is, I'll never know how close they came to unzipping that tent while I was inside. I had been planning a solo camping trip for a while. I wanted to get away from everything, from work, from noise, from people. I packed up my gear one Friday morning and drove out of the city. My plan was to camp for 2 nights in a state park I had never been to before. It wasn't far from the main road, but it was big enough that you could hike deep in and find quiet spots where you wouldn't hear a single car or see a single person. That's what I wanted. I wanted silence, just me in the woods. The park itself was thick with pine and oak, with trails that cut into the deeper areas. I had looked at maps before going and saw that there was a small stream running through the middle of it, and if I followed one of the longer trails, I could set up camp somewhere near the water. I parked my car in a small gravel lot, locked it up, shouldered my pack, and started walking in. It was late afternoon and the sun was still strong. The air smelled like dry leaves and sap. The trail was narrow, dirt packed from years of use, lined with tall grass in some places and tree roots sticking out in others. I could hear insects buzzing and birds calling in the trees above me. It felt peaceful. I walked for about an hour before I reached a clearing near the stream. It was exactly what I wanted. There was a flat area under some tall pines with soft ground and enough open space for a tent. The stream was only about 30 feet away, shallow, moving slowly over rocks. The sound of the water was faint but constant, a kind of background noise that made everything feel calm. I dropped my pack, stretched out my shoulders, and began setting up my tent. It didn't take long. After that, I gathered some wood from the ground and built a small fire ring with rocks. I sat there as the sky turned from light blue to orange and the woods grew darker. I cooked a simple meal over the fire, ate slowly, and then leaned back against a log. The fire crackled and the smell of smoke rose into the air. I felt good. The quiet was what I wanted. I didn't hear cars, didn't hear people, only the stream and the sound of leaves shifting in the wind. When night came, it came fast. The fire was the only light. Beyond it, the trees were dark shapes, their tops fading into the black sky. I could see stars overhead more than I ever saw back home. I stayed up for a while, poking at the fire, sipping water, just letting my mind rest. Then, when I started to feel heavy, I put out most of the fire, leaving only some embers glowing, and I crawled into my tent. Inside, it was quiet. I lay on my sleeping bag listening. At first, I only heard crickets in the stream. But as I stayed still, I started noticing little things. Twigs snapping somewhere, leaves shifting like something had brushed past them. The longer I listened, the more I realized how alive the woods were at night. I told myself it was all normal. Animals moving around, raccoons, squirrels, maybe even deer. It wasn't anything strange. I closed my eyes and eventually drifted off. I don't know how long I slept before I woke again. It was still dark, but the air in the tent felt colder. I stayed still for a moment, then realized why I woke. There had been a sound, not like the small ones before. This was heavier, like something moving across the ground. I held my breath and listened. I heard it again. Leaves being stepped on. Slow, deliberate. Then it stopped. I told myself again that it could be a deer, or maybe just the wind dropping something from a tree, but it didn't feel the same. There was a weight to it, like someone was walking. I stayed awake for a long time, staring at the dark ceiling of the tent. After a while, I didn't hear anything else. I finally let my eyes close again, though it wasn't easy. When I woke up in the morning, everything looked normal. The sunlight was soft through the trees. The stream was moving quietly, and the fire pit had gone cold. I stepped outside and stretched. My nerves felt stupid now. In the light, the woods didn't feel threatening at all. I made breakfast, walked down to the stream, and filled my bottle. After eating, I decided to hike a little further down the trail with only a small pack. I wanted to explore, maybe find where the stream got wider. I left my main camp set up since I planned on coming back before night. The trail was uneven, covered in sticks and rocks, but the deeper I went, the quieter it got. After about an hour, I realized I hadn't seen or heard another person the entire time I had been here. I had expected maybe to run into another hiker, but there was no one. The longer I walked, the more isolated it felt. I stopped near a bend in the stream where the trees grew thicker. The water was darker here, shaded by branches overhead. I sat on a rock and let myself rest. While I sat there, I had this odd feeling, like I wasn't alone. I turned slowly, looking through the trees. Nothing moved. Still, the thought lingered. I headed back toward camp earlier than planned. I didn't like the way it felt that far in. When I reached my tent again, the sun was already dipping lower. I started a fire, cooked another meal, and tried to shake the unease. That night it happened again. I lay in my tent trying to fall asleep, and I heard it. The same steps, slow, careful, too heavy for a raccoon, too steady for chance. I didn't move. I just listened. The steps circled slowly around the area. Then they stopped again. I was sweating even though the night air was cold. Every sound seemed louder now. Every crack of a branch or rustle of leaves. Eventually, after what felt like hours, I didn't hear it anymore. I must have dozed off out of pure exhaustion. In the morning, I stepped outside, looking around carefully. My camp looked the same, but the ground didn't. In the dirt near the edge of the trees, I saw a mark. It wasn't sharp, but it looked like part of a footprint. Not an animal's, a person's. I stared at it for a long time. My throat felt dry. At that point, I started to think seriously about leaving. But a part of me told myself I was overreacting. Maybe it wasn't a footprint. Maybe I was imagining it because I was tired and jumpy. I stayed another day, though the peace I had wanted was gone. I kept looking into the trees, listening, waiting. When night came, I made my fire bigger than before. I sat close to it, the flames warming my face. I stayed up late poking at the logs, forcing myself not to go inside the tent too soon. But eventually I had to. I lay there in the dark, tense. I heard nothing for a long time. Then closer to midnight I heard it again. The steps. This time they came closer. I could hear the crunch of leaves just outside my tent. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would shake the whole tent. The steps stopped only a few feet away. I lay there frozen, holding my breath, eyes wide open in the dark. Whoever or whatever it was standing right there. Minutes passed. Then I heard the faintest shift, like someone leaning or crouching. My skin crawled, I don't know how long it lasted. Eventually, the steps moved again, fading slowly into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I just lay there waiting for daylight. When the sun came, I packed up fast. I doused the fire, stuffed everything into my bag, and left. I didn't even stop to eat. As I hiked back, I kept looking over my shoulder. The trail seemed longer than before, the trees heavier. At one point, I thought I heard something moving behind me, but I didn't stop to check. When I finally reached the gravel lot, my car was there, untouched. I threw my gear inside, climbed in, and locked the doors. Driving away, I felt like I could finally breathe. But even as the miles stretched between me and the park, I couldn't shake it. Someone had been out there with me, watching, waiting, and I had no idea who it was or what they wanted. That was the last time I ever camped alone. I decided to go camping alone because I wanted some time away from everything. I had been working nonstop for months and I needed quiet. No noise of the city, no screens, no pressure. Just the sound of wind through the trees and the smell of pine needles under my boots. I picked a random state forest I had never been to before. It wasn't too far from home, maybe 3 hours of driving, but far enough to feel like another world. I didn't tell anyone exactly which spot I would camp at. I only said I was going into the forest for the weekend. I thought that would be enough. The drive out there was calm. The roads got smaller and quieter as I went, turning from wide highways to narrow 2-lane country roads, then to gravel that wound through thick woods. I rolled my window down and felt the cool September air brush against my face. The forest smelled damp, like leaves and moss, and it reminded me of childhood hikes. I parked at a small pull-off spot near a dirt trail that led deeper into the trees. There were no other cars around. I thought that was perfect. I wanted space to myself. I strapped my backpack on and locked the car. I had packed carefully. Tent, sleeping bag, food for 2 days, extra clothes, water, a small hatchet, flashlight, batteries, and a first aid kit. My backpack felt heavy at first, but the weight settled in as I walked down the trail. The dirt path was narrow and uneven, covered with leaves that crunched under my boots. The canopy above was thick, and light filtered down in green patches. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own footsteps echo between the trees. I walked for maybe 40 minutes before I found a small clearing. It wasn't marked, but the ground was flat and mostly clear of rocks and roots. There was a big fallen tree at the edge, and the way the forest opened up made it feel like a good camping spot. I dropped my pack and stretched my shoulders, then started setting up camp. I pushed the tent poles into the ground, stretched the fabric tight, and hammered the stakes with a rock I found nearby. After the tent was up, I rolled out the sleeping bag inside and placed my gear neatly at one side. I liked things organized. It made me feel calmer. The afternoon passed slowly. I gathered some dry wood and stacked it near the fallen tree. I cooked a simple meal on my small camping stove, canned beans and bread, and sat with my back against the log while eating. The forest was peaceful, filled with little sounds, birds calling, squirrels scratching through leaves, the occasional creak of trees shifting in the wind. I let my mind wander, staring up at the branches above. The sky turned from pale blue to orange, then purple as the sun sank. I lit my fire, small at first, then bigger once the flames caught. It glowed warmly against the dark trees. By the time the night came fully, the woods felt different. Shadows stretched far between the trunks, and the air grew colder. The fire cracked, sending sparks up into the night. I kept feeding it wood, sitting close to the warmth. Beyond the ring of firelight, the trees seemed endless. Every little snap of a twig in the dark made me turn my head. I told myself it was only animals, deer, or raccoons. I tried not to think about anything else. At some point, I decided to walk a little beyond the fire's glow, just to stretch my legs. I carried my flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, showing trunks, branches, leaves, and the ground covered in needles. It felt strange stepping away from the fire. The quiet grew heavier. I walked maybe 30 feet out, then stopped and turned the light slowly around. Everything looked normal. Still, I felt the hairs rise on the back of my neck. I headed back and sat closer to the fire than before. I eventually crawled into my tent, zipped the flap, and laid down in the sleeping bag. The fire outside had burned down to glowing coals. I left it that way, dim but not completely out. Inside the tent, the sounds of the forest were louder. I could hear branches tapping against each other, owls hooting, and once, a faraway crack that could have been a tree snapping. My mind ran in circles. I told myself I was safe, but I kept listening, straining my ears for anything unusual. Sleep came slowly in pieces. I would drift, then wake at the sound of rustling, then drift again. Somewhere deep in the night, I woke suddenly. My eyes opened to the dark tent, and my heart was already beating fast like I had heard something in my sleep. I lay still listening. At first there was nothing but silence, then I caught it. Faint, steady crunching of leaves outside. Not fast, not random like an animal scurrying. It was slow, deliberate, heavy. Footsteps, my mouth went dry. I tried to tell myself it could be a deer, but it didn't sound like hooves. It sounded like weight pressing down one step at a time. The sound moved around, circling faintly, stopping, then starting again. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound inside the tent. My flashlight was near my hand, but I didn't dare unzip the flap. The steps grew louder for a moment, then faded away into the trees. I lay there, frozen, for what felt like an hour. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me back under, though my sleep was thin and restless. When morning came, sunlight filtered through the tent fabric. I unzipped the flap and crawled out, blinking against the light. The fire was dead, just gray ash and blackened wood. The forest looked calm again, bright and harmless. But when I walked around the clearing, I saw the ground. There were prints in the dirt and leaves, not mine. Footprints, faint but visible, leading from one side of the clearing to the other. They weren't boots like mine. They looked like worn shoes. Smooth bottoms with faint tread. My chest tightened. Someone had been there. I packed up my stove and ate a little food, but I couldn't shake the unease. I told myself maybe it was just a lost hiker passing through. But if it was, why in the middle of the night walking so close to my tent? I tried to convince myself it was nothing, but I noticed the prints came close, stopping just a few feet from where I had been sleeping. Whoever it was, they had stood there quietly, facing my tent before moving on. The thought made me shiver. The day passed slowly again. I tried to distract myself by walking the trails, exploring deeper into the woods. The air was crisp and the forest was beautiful, but every sound made me turn my head. I felt like I was being watched. When I returned to camp in the afternoon, I noticed something I hadn't left like that. One of the pieces of firewood was moved away from the pile, lying by itself. I was sure I hadn't done that. My stomach twisted. Maybe I had overlooked it or maybe not. I couldn't be sure. As night fell again, my nerves grew sharper. I built my fire bigger this time, feeding it often, not wanting the light to shrink too much. I sat close, staring into the flames, my ears tuned to the dark beyond. Hours passed and I kept myself awake, fighting off drowsiness. Then I heard it again, crunching in the leaves, faint but clear. My whole body tensed. The sound came from deeper in the woods, slowly circling, pausing, then moving again. My fire popped and I threw on more wood, trying to make it blaze brighter. I thought maybe the light would keep whoever it was away. The sound grew closer, then faded. I gripped the hatchet from my pack and kept it in my lap, my hands slick with sweat. Time dragged, and eventually I must have dozed off by the fire. I woke with a start when I felt something, like eyes on me. I looked around quickly. The fire was low, just glowing embers again. Beyond it, the trees were nothing but shadows. I strained to see, then I caught it. Movement, a figure slipping between the trees too far to make out details. Just the shape of a person. My chest tightened as if a fist had grabbed it. I stood, clutching the hatchet, and stared into the dark. The figure didn't come closer. It just stood there, half hidden, then slowly stepped back until I couldn't see it anymore. I stayed awake the rest of the night, pacing the edge of the firelight, my nerves shot. When dawn finally came, I made my choice. I was done. I packed everything quickly, my hands shaking as I stuffed the sleeping bag and tore down the tent. I kept glancing at the trees, expecting to see someone standing there, Once everything was in my pack, I slung it on and started back toward the trail. The woods felt heavier than before, every sound sharp in my ears. I walked fast, almost jogging, the straps of my pack digging into my shoulders. About halfway back, I froze. On the dirt path ahead of me, I saw footprints again. Fresh ones. They weren't mine, and they were facing toward me as if someone had been standing there waiting, then stepped aside. My throat tightened. I kept moving, faster now, my eyes darting everywhere. The forest felt like it was closing in. I didn't stop until I saw my car through the trees. The relief of seeing it almost made my knees give out. I rushed to it, dropped my pack inside, and fumbled the keys into the ignition. I locked the doors before starting it. As I pulled out, gravel spraying under the tires, I glanced once into the woods. At the tree line just beyond the road, I thought I saw him again. The faint outline of someone standing still, watching. I didn't slow down. I drove until the forest was far behind me, not stopping until I reached the highway. When I finally got home, I sat in my car for a long time before going inside. I couldn't stop thinking about the footsteps, the figure, the print's clo. I always thought camping alone would clear my head. I had been stressed for months, my routine felt heavy, and being stuck in the city made me feel like I was suffocating. I figured being away from screens, noise, and people would help. I picked a small park that allowed camping, not far from town, but far enough that at night it would feel like I was completely cut off. It wasn't a big national forest or anything, just a regular park with some trails, a few open clearings, and some woods that went on deeper than most people expected. It was the kind of place where kids might come during the day to bike or hike, but at night it emptied out. That was exactly what I wanted. Isolation, quiet, time to think. I left in the afternoon with a backpack, a tent, a sleeping bag, a small cooler with water bottles and food, and a flashlight. I didn't overpack because I wanted the trip to feel simple. The air was warm but not too hot, late summer weather, and the sky was clear. By the time I got there, the park was almost empty except for one car near the entrance. Probably someone still on the trail. I parked, shouldered my pack, and walked down the dirt path until I found a spot that looked good. It was a flat piece of ground with enough trees around it to give cover, but not too thick that it felt closed in. From there, I could just barely hear the sound of cars in the distance if I focused hard, but mostly it was just wind in the trees and the buzz of insects. I set up my tent, laid out the sleeping bag, and stacked some of my supplies near the entrance. I wasn't planning to make a fire that first night since I didn't want to deal with the smell of smoke or worry about it burning out. I had snacks, a lantern, and a book, so I thought I would be fine. As the sun started to go down, the woods changed. The birds quieted down, the insects grew louder, and the shadows stretched across the ground. I've camped before with friends, and I know that moment when night starts to fall always makes you feel smaller than you expect. I reminded myself it was just me and the trees, nothing else. By the time it was fully dark, the park was silent. I had seen no other people on my way in, no hikers, no campers. That was what I wanted. But there was something about being the only person in a wide open park that made me more aware of every little sound. I could hear leaves shifting in the breeze, twigs snapping far off, the occasional distant animal call. Each one felt sharper than it would have if I was home. I tried to read under the lantern light, but I kept pausing to listen. It wasn't fear exactly, just that feeling like my senses were stuck on high alert. Around midnight, I lay in my sleeping bag, the tent zipped up, my flashlight beside me. I tried to sleep, but my body wouldn't relax. The noises outside seemed to be getting closer, though I knew animals moved at night and most of them had no interest in me. I told myself that again and again. But at one point I heard footsteps. Not an animal scurrying, not something brushing leaves. It sounded heavier, like a person stepping carefully. My chest tightened and I held my breath. The steps moved slowly, crunching the dry leaves, stopping, then starting again. They were faint at first, but soon they sounded like they were circling my tent. I didn't move. I just stared at the thin wall of fabric separating me from outside. I thought maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was confusing the sound of branches falling or a raccoon. but then I heard a definite snap, like weight pressing down on a stick. My skin prickled. I waited, heart pounding, gripping the flashlight. The footsteps grew softer, moving away. After a long while, I couldn't hear anything but the usual night noises. I lay there for what felt like an hour, straining to pick out anything human in the sound. Eventually, I drifted into a light, shaky sleep. When I woke up, the sun was already up and everything felt normal again. The fear of the night seemed ridiculous in daylight. I stepped outside, stretched, and looked around. My little campsite looked untouched. The ground near the tent, though, had something that made my stomach turn. The leaves and dirt were disturbed, like someone had walked around in a circle. There were faint marks, not clear shoe prints, but enough of an outline that I knew it wasn't a deer or raccoon. I stared at them for a long time, my skin cold despite the morning sun. I thought about leaving then, packing up, going back to my car and forgetting the whole thing. But I kept telling myself I might just be overreacting. Maybe it was a trick of light. Maybe the wind or small animals had shifted the ground more than I thought. I didn't want to look like a coward to myself, so I stayed. I walked the trails during the day, took pictures, ate lunch, and convinced myself nothing was wrong. By evening, though, the nervousness came back. I kept glancing into the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there. The park was quiet again. Too quiet. I didn't see any other visitors at all. I set up a small fire that night just to give myself something to focus on. The crackle of the flames helped cover up the softer noises from the woods, and the light made me feel less trapped. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. It started the same way. Soft, slow steps, somewhere in the dark. Not close at first, but moving closer. My stomach knotted as I froze by the fire, listening. The steps stopped when I held still. When I poked at the fire, they started again. Whoever it was, they were being careful. Watching me, I stood up, gripping the flashlight tight. I aimed it toward the trees, swinging the beam across the trunks and undergrowth. The light caught nothing. Just leaves, shadows, branches swaying. But I knew I wasn't imagining it, I felt it. The air felt heavy, charged. I decided not to wait around. I grabbed my bag, stomped out the fire, and went into the tent. I zipped it up tight and lay down, every muscle tense. The footsteps came back. Closer this time. They circled again, pausing just feet away from me. I could hear leaves crunching right outside the thin wall of fabric. My throat was dry and I held my breath so long my chest hurt. Then there was silence. Not even insects, just silence. That was worse than the footsteps. I didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning, when I finally crawled out, the ground was marked again. Clearer this time. There were shoe prints. Definitely human. A person had walked right up to my tent and stood there. The prints went off into the trees, but I couldn't see where they ended. That was it. I packed up fast, shoving everything into my bag, not caring if it was neat. I wasn't staying another night. As I walked the trail back, I kept checking over my shoulder. Every crunch of my boots made me flinch, and I couldn't shake the feeling someone was behind me. When I reached the parking lot, my stomach dropped. My car was there, but something was wrong. The driver's side door was slightly open. My hands shook as I stepped closer. The inside of the car smelled different, like someone had been sitting in it. On the passenger seat was something I hadn't left there. A folded piece of paper. I picked it up. My name was written on the outside in messy handwriting. I didn't open it. I dropped it on the ground, got in the car, locked the doors, and drove out of the park as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I never went camping alone again. I remember that trip more clearly than most of the others I have taken. Maybe because I spent every minute of it in a strange state between fear and exhaustion. It was supposed to be nothing more than a quick weekend getaway. I had packed light, just the basics I always carried when I wanted to disappear into the woods for a couple of nights. My backpack had a tent rolled tight against the side, a sleeping bag, a small stove, a lighter, a flashlight, some dry food, a water filter, and a knife I always kept in the front pouch. It was early autumn. The air still had warmth during the day, but the nights had begun to bite with a sharp chill. I wanted the quiet more than anything. My work had drained me, and I figured a couple nights under the trees would reset my head. I drove out to a random state forest I had never camped in before, just following the map until I spotted a stretch of green that seemed far enough from town. The parking lot at the trailhead was almost empty, just 2 other cars sitting with dust across their windshields. I slung my backpack over my shoulders and started walking down the dirt path. The trail wasn't well maintained. The leaves covered it in patches and broken branches lay across it. The silence struck me right away. No people, no distant hum of roads, just the faintest sounds of wind stirring branches and the occasional bird hidden somewhere in the canopy. After an hour of steady walking, I veered off the main trail. I liked to be far from where anyone else might set up camp. I wanted no voices, no loud music, no dogs running through the brush. I pushed deeper into the woods until the trail was gone and I was moving only by sense of direction. The sun hung low, bleeding orange light through the trees, and I decided I'd gone far enough. I found a spot on a small ridge. It wasn't high, but it gave me a decent view through the trees, and I could see a shallow dip below where a stream trickled. The ground was clear enough to pitch my tent, so I dropped my pack and began setting up. By the time I had the tent staked down, the sun had slipped behind the tree line, and the shadows stretched long. I boiled some water on the stove, poured it over dried noodles, and sat back against my pack to eat. The woods at night are always louder than people expect. Crickets, frogs, the distant crack of branches when some animal moves through. Small things, but constant. I'm used to it. I've camped enough times to know the difference between harmless noise and something worth worrying about. That first night, nothing stood out. I crawled into my tent, zipped the door, and slid into my sleeping bag. Sometime after midnight, I woke. I didn't know what stirred me at first. My tent was dark except for the faintest gray wash of moonlight pressing through the fabric. I lay still, breathing slow, listening. Then I heard it. A crunch of leaves. Not far. Then another. The weight was heavy, too heavy for a rabbit or raccoon. My hand drifted to the knife in the pouch by my head. The steps paused. I could hear only the sound of my own pulse in my ears. Then the steps moved again, slow, measured, circling. Whoever it was or whatever, it wasn't rushing. It was moving with purpose, close enough that I could follow its path around the tent. I lay rigid, gripping the knife, trying to control my breathing. Finally, the steps faded. I stayed awake long after, staring into the dark until exhaustion pulled me under again. In the morning, the first thing I did was step outside and check the ground. The leaves were disturbed in wide arcs around my tent, crushed down in spots where something heavy had walked. But there were no clear prints, just scuffs. I told myself it could have been a deer. A big one. I tried to believe it. I boiled more water, made coffee, and packed a small bag for a day hike. I thought maybe moving around, keeping busy, would push away the unease from the night. I followed the ridge and cut down toward the stream. The water was cold, running clear over smooth stones. I crouched, filled my bottle, and took a long drink. That's when I saw it. Across the stream, pressed against the trunk of a tree, was a shirt, a plain flannel torn at the sleeves, stained dark. It wasn't new, but it hadn't been out there long either. I picked it up, felt the dampness of the fabric, and put it back down. Something about it unsettled me, though I couldn't explain why. People left trash in the woods all the time. It shouldn't have mattered. I hiked for hours, climbing ridges, cutting through brush, marking my path with broken sticks so I wouldn't get turned around. The forest grew thicker the deeper I went. Quieter too, as if the animals had moved elsewhere. By late afternoon, I looped back to camp, tired but glad to see the bright nylon of my tent through the trees. The second night was colder. I built a fire and sat close, the flames throwing shadows up the trunks. I cooked a small meal, listened to the forest noises, and tried not to think about the steps outside my tent. But when I finally lay down, sleep didn't come easily. Again, sometime deep in the night, I woke. This time the sound was different. Not just footsteps circling, but a sharper snap like wood breaking. Then silence. I waited, holding my breath, every muscle tight. A new sound followed. Not walking this time, but breathing. Faint, drawn-out breaths, just outside the thin wall of fabric. I froze. The knife was already in my hand. The breathing lingered, moving along one side of the tent, then the other. Then after a long stretch, it faded. I didn't sleep again. When dawn finally bled gray through the fabric, I unzipped the door and stepped out. The ground was marked again, disturbed in wide circles, but near the fire pit I saw something that turned my stomach. A line of stones laid out neatly, one after the other, leading from the ashes toward the trees. It hadn't been there before, that was enough. I packed my gear in silence, shoving everything into my backpack, breaking down the tent with clumsy hands. My only thought was to get out, to reach the trailhead, to put distance between me and whatever had been moving around my camp. The hike back should have been straightforward. I had marked my way, broken branches, small signs to follow, but as I moved I couldn't find them. Every ridge looked the same. Every cluster of trees felt repeated. I adjusted my course, tried to angle west, certain I'd hit the trail again, but the hours dragged and the sun shifted overhead. By afternoon I realized I was lost. My throat was dry and my legs ached from moving without rest. I stopped at a stream to drink and refill my bottle, but the moment I crouched down I saw it again. Another shirt. Not the same one as before, but another piece of clothing. This time a jacket, folded almost carefully across a rock. I left it untouched and kept walking. My chest felt tight, as though the woods themselves had closed in around me. As dusk returned, I found no trail, no familiar marker, only more trees pressing close. My only choice was to set up camp again. I chose a hollow against a fallen log, pitched the tent quickly, and sat with my back against it, knife in hand, as the dark swallowed the forest. That night was the worst. I don't know how long I lay awake before I heard the first sound. It wasn't footsteps this time. It was the sound of something being dragged through leaves. Slow, heavy, pausing, then starting again. It circled wide, then moved closer. Then came the breathing again. Louder, standing still just outside the tent. I pressed the knife to my chest, terrified it would cut through the thin fabric. The sound didn't move away this time. It lingered for what felt like hours, the breathing steady, patient. My chest burned from holding back my own breath. At some point, my exhaustion overwhelmed the fear, and I drifted into a shallow, broken sleep. When I woke, light had returned and the forest was silent. I stepped outside, heart pounding, and saw what had changed. In front of the tent, pressed into the dirt, was a boot print. Clear, deep, pointing straight toward where I had slept. I didn't eat, didn't drink, didn't do anything but start moving. I didn't care about direction anymore. I just pushed forward, climbing ridges, stumbling through brush, sweating despite the cool air. The hours blurred. My legs shook from fatigue and my pack dug into my shoulders, but I didn't stop. Late in the day, I heard something I hadn't heard in days. A voice, faint, distant, but real. I froze, straining to listen. Then I saw movement ahead, a flash of orange through the trees. I pushed harder, crashing through branches until I stumbled out onto a dirt trail. A pair of hikers stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. I must have looked half mad, pale, covered in sweat, clutching the knife in my hand. I forced myself to lower it, to breathe, to explain where I had come from. They pointed me back toward the trailhead, only an hour's walk away. I followed their directions, refusing to look back, until I saw the glint of my car through the trees. When I finally dropped my pack in the dirt and slid into the driver's seat, the relief hit me so hard, I almost cried. I sat there gripping the wheel, staring out at the quiet forest. I drove away without looking back. I don't know who was out there, circling my tent, leaving those prints dragging something through the leaves. Maybe it was some drifter living off the grid. Maybe something worse. I'll never know. What I do know is that I'll never camp alone again. I always liked going camping alone because it gave me space away from people, away from noise, away from work. I never thought of it as dangerous, at least not in the way movies or stories show it. I thought if I stayed smart, brought enough supplies, and kept to myself, nothing could go too wrong. That fall, when the air was sharp and the trees were losing their leaves, I decided to camp for 3 nights in a state forest I had never visited before. It wasn't too far from the highway, but deep enough that you couldn't hear cars once you were inside. The park office had a sign-in sheet, but after that there was nothing. Just dirt paths, tall trees, and a lot of quiet. The first day was calm. I carried my pack through trails that twisted between oaks and pines. The ground was thick with leaves that had fallen and crunched under my boots. The air smelled of soil and damp bark, and everything was still. I set up my tent on a flat patch close to a small stream. It wasn't an official campsite, but I had seen signs that others had used the spot before. The stream would give me water, and the ground was clear enough for fire. I pitched my tent, stacked some rocks into a rough fire ring, and gathered wood. Everything felt fine, almost too easy. By evening, I had a small fire going, a pot of instant noodles boiling, and the sound of the water running steady a few yards away. It felt like the kind of camping trip I wanted. Quiet, simple, peaceful. I ate, cleaned up, and sat by the fire until it burned low. By the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was already dark, and the sound of crickets and running water filled the silence. I fell asleep without trouble. It was around the middle of the night when I first woke up. I wasn't sure why. My fire was dead, my tent was cold, and I could hear something faint in the distance. At first I thought it was the wind moving through the branches. But the more I lay there listening, the more it sounded like steps. They weren't close. They were soft, uneven, and slow. Leaves crunched, then it would stop, then crunch again. I told myself it was probably a deer or raccoon. That was normal. Animals moved around at night, and I was in their space. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes. The next morning I looked around the area, half expecting to see tracks. The leaves were too thick to show prints clearly, but I did notice spots where they looked disturbed, pressed down in little patches like something heavy had moved over them. It could have been anything, I told myself. I tried to shake the thought and went on with my day. I walked trails, gathered more wood, and sat by the stream for hours. I felt normal again until the evening came and the sun dropped behind the trees. That night the sound came again. This time it was closer. I lay in my tent with my heart pounding while I listened. The steps were slow, almost careful, like whoever or whatever it was didn't want to be heard. The crunch of leaves would come, then silence. Then again, closer. I held my breath for a long time, clutching the knife I kept beside me. It went on for what felt like hours. At one point I heard a twig snap so close to my tent that I froze, certain someone was right outside. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe loud. Eventually the sounds faded. When morning came, I was so exhausted I could barely think. I checked again outside. This time I saw it clearer. Behind my tent, about 20 feet away, the leaves were disturbed in a straight path leading back into the trees. The weight was too heavy for a raccoon, and the spacing of the prints seemed too long for a deer. It looked like a person had walked there. My stomach twisted. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I had told myself 3 nights, and I hated the idea of feeling scared out of a place just because of noises. Still, I couldn't ignore it anymore. That day I kept myself busy, but my mind kept circling the thought of someone walking around my tent at night. I checked my phone for signal. There was barely one bar if I stood at the edge of the stream and held it up. It wasn't enough to call. I thought about hiking back to the car, but it was miles away and the sun was already low. I told myself one more night and I'd leave in the morning. That evening I built a bigger fire and sat close to it, hoping light would keep anything away. I barely ate. I just sat listening. Every sound in the forest felt sharp. When I finally crawled into my tent, I left my knife in my hand. It started earlier this time. Not even an hour after I lay down, I heard it. Steps. Slow, careful, circling. They moved around my tent, pausing now and then. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the faint brush of something against bark. My whole body was tight with fear. I didn't dare move. At one point, the steps stopped right outside. I could see a faint shadow through the thin fabric of my tent, just a blur of shape. My hand tightened on the knife. The figure didn't move for what felt like forever. Then slowly it walked away. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every sound set me off. Every time the wind moved the branches, I thought it was back. By dawn, my nerves were shot. I stepped out of the tent the second there was light. The ground around me told me everything I needed to know. Clear footprints this time, pressed deep into the soft dirt by the stream. Human footprints, bare feet. They circled my tent again and again, then led back into the woods. I packed fast, my hands shaking. I didn't bother with breakfast, didn't bother folding my tent. I shoved everything into my pack and started down the trail. My only thought was getting out. The forest, which had felt so calm before, now felt like it was closing in on me. Every tree looked like it could hide someone. Every sound made me snap my head around. About halfway back, I noticed something that stopped me cold. In the dirt of the trail just ahead were more footprints. Bare feet again. The tracks weren't mine. They were fresh, pressed into the damp soil, leading the same way I was walking. Someone had gone down this path before me. My chest tightened. I didn't know if they were ahead or hiding somewhere off the trail. I forced myself to keep moving, but slower, listening hard. At one point, I swore I heard something in the brush beside me, like leaves shifting. I kept my knife out, my heart slamming. I walked like that for miles, expecting someone to step out. When I finally reached the parking lot, I almost cried. My car was there, no one else's. The whole lot was empty. I threw my pack in the back, jumped in, and locked the doors. As I sat there catching my breath, I looked down at the edge of the lot where the dirt met the pavement. My stomach dropped. There were prints there too. Bare feet again, coming out of the woods, stopping just a few feet from my car. I started the engine and drove, faster than I should have, not looking back. For days after, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Whoever it was, they hadn't tried to rob me. They hadn't spoken. They hadn't attacked. They just circled, watched, and followed. Somehow that was worse. I never went back to that forest. Even now, when I think about camping, I remember those bare footprints circling my tent in the dark, standing just inches from me while I lay there awake, holding a knife, too scared to breathe. I never really liked planning things, and most of the trips I've ever gone on happened without much thought. This one was the same. Random. That's the only word I can use to explain it. I picked a place on a map, saw a patch of green that marked a forest area with campgrounds nearby, and decided I would go there alone for the weekend. I wasn't chasing peace or adventure. I wasn't looking to test myself or prove something. I just wanted to step away from my routine for a few days, sit by a fire, and hear nothing but the sound of leaves and water. I packed quickly, throwing a tent, sleeping bag, flashlight, extra batteries, small camp stove, food, and some clothes into the back of my car. I carried a simple knife, a lighter, and some rope. Not because I expected to need them, but because that's what everyone says you should carry when going camping. The whole thing was random. No research, no calls to the park office, no backup plan, just drive and see. The drive took almost 5 hours. The road narrowed the deeper I went into the wooded area, with trees leaning close to the edge. It was late afternoon when I found the sign pointing to the campground. A cracked wooden post with faded letters. I pulled into the gravel lot where only 2 other cars were parked. There was no ranger station open, only a locked booth with a slot for payment envelopes. I stuffed cash in and wrote my license plate on the slip before dropping it inside. The sites were spread out, each with a ring of stones for fire, a flat patch for tents, and a picnic table worn smooth by weather. I picked one near the tree line, close enough to the river I could hear the steady water but not see it. The other 2 cars were parked far apart, so I felt like I had the place to myself. That was part of the draw. I set up my tent slowly, checking the ground for roots before hammering in the stakes. The air had that smell of damp earth mixed with pine needles, heavy but clean. Birds called from higher up in the trees, and sometimes I caught the sound of something moving in the brush, though it never came close. I boiled water on the stove and poured it into a pouch of dehydrated food, eating in silence. It felt good at first. Simple. The kind of quiet that doesn't exist at home. By the time the sun dropped, the forest around me changed. The brightness turned to a dim, even glow, and everything sounded closer. The river's noise was sharper. The crunch of a branch in the woods made me look up fast, and the wind that stirred the leaves felt colder. I lit a fire, fed it until the flame stretched high, and sat on the ground beside it with my knees pulled up. I stared at the fire for hours, feeding it with wood I gathered earlier until my eyes blurred from the smoke. I crawled into the tent late, zipped the flap, and lay flat on the sleeping bag. The ground was harder than I expected, and every shift made the nylon crinkle loud in my ears. I listened for sounds outside, small cracks, rustling, A low rushing sound that could have been the river or the wind through the branches. Sleep came in pieces. The first night passed without anything worth remembering, though I woke often. Sometimes from my own movements, sometimes from the feeling that something brushed against the edge of the tent. Each time I told myself it was only branches moving in the wind or an animal sniffing around. Nothing unusual. I'd read about raccoons, even deer wandering close to campsites. I convinced myself that was all. The morning came pale and cold. I crawled out, stretched stiff muscles, and made coffee on the stove. Mist clung low to the trees, drifting slowly like smoke, and my breath made small clouds in the air. I spent the morning wandering the trails, following the path to the river where rocks broke the water into white foam. I crouched there watching, tossing stones and letting the sound of rushing water fill my head. For a few hours it was peaceful. When I returned to camp, the first thing I noticed was that something was different. I couldn't place it at first. My fire pit was the same, the tent untouched. But the items on the table weren't where I'd left them. The small pan I used for boiling water was moved, pushed closer to the edge. The rope I'd coiled was unrolled, stretched out across the table. For a long moment I just stared. My chest felt tight, my mouth dry. The rational explanation came quickly. An animal, a raccoon maybe, sniffing around, dragging things. But the pan hadn't been knocked down or scratched. It was placed. The rope wasn't chewed or tangled. It was uncoiled and laid straight, like someone had run their hand across it. I spent the rest of the day unsettled. I told myself not to overthink it. Maybe I'd left things like that and simply didn't remember. Maybe I had been careless. Still, I kept looking at the tree line, expecting someone to be standing there watching. That night, I built the fire bigger, feeding it until sparks spun upward like fireflies. I stayed awake longer, waiting, listening. I kept the flashlight close and my knife in the pocket of my jacket. The sounds in the woods never stopped, branches breaking, leaves crunching. But I couldn't tell which were natural and which weren't. When I finally lay in the tent, I left the zipper half open so I could see out toward the fire. My eyes grew heavy, closing and snapping open again as the flames sank lower. At some point I must have drifted. I woke in the middle of the night. No sound woke me, but I was instantly aware something was wrong. I stayed still, barely breathing, ears straining. The fire outside had burned down to glowing coals, and then I heard it. Slow, steady steps on the gravel near my car. Not heavy like an animal, but deliberate, human. The sound moved closer, circling the campsite. My heart hammered against the ground beneath me. I reached quietly for the flashlight, my hand shaking. I didn't turn it on. I just held it. The steps crunched past the table toward the fire pit and then stopped. I lay frozen, every muscle screaming not to move. After what felt like hours, the steps started again, retreating into the woods. Branches shifted and then silence. I didn't sleep again that night. I lay with eyes wide open until the first pale light crept through the tent fabric. When I stepped out, everything looked normal. The pan and rope were untouched, the fire pit the same. My car sat in the same place, but the gravel told the truth. Clear footprints circled the site, pressed into the damp ground. Not boots, not heavy shoes. Bare feet, I felt sick. My skin crawled with the thought of someone walking around while I lay defenseless, only a thin layer of nylon away. I wanted to pack and leave, but a stubborn part of me argued against it. I'd come all this way. It was just some stranger passing through. Maybe a drunk from one of the other campsites wandering at night. Nothing happened. I was fine. The third day dragged. I tried to distract myself with hikes, but every sound made me whip around, expecting someone to be there. When I returned, I found small changes again. The lid of my cooler was open, though nothing was taken. The knife I left on the table was stuck upright in the wood, blade buried deep. I hadn't done that. I knew I hadn't. That night, I didn't even try to sleep in the tent. I sat by the fire with the knife in hand, flashlight beside me, waiting. My ears played tricks, but then I heard it again. Steps, from the same direction. Slow, patient. They circled wide, never rushing, just moving from tree to tree, as though testing me. I stood and shined the flashlight into the woods, but the beam only caught trunks and leaves. The sound stopped each time the light swept past. When I turned it off, the steps started again. Closer this time. The hours bled by like that. My nerves frayed until I couldn't tell if the sounds were real or in my head. Near dawn, exhaustion won, and I sank into a shallow sleep by the fire. When I woke, the knife was gone from my hand. It was stuck in the dirt inches from my head. I couldn't stay anymore. I packed fast, tossing things into the car without folding or checking. My hands shook so bad I dropped half of it. I didn't care. I wanted to be gone before night came again. As I drove down the gravel road, I looked once in the mirror. Just for a second, behind me at the edge of the trees, a figure stood. Still, barefoot, watching. I never went back to random trips after that. I planned every detail, checked maps, read reviews, stayed only where I wasn't alone. Because the thought that stays with me isn't that someone was out there in the woods. It's that whoever they were, they knew I was unprepared, alone and random enough to pick the wrong place at the wrong time.